a quiet July night in 1969. Over 600 million people held their breath as an American astronaut placed his boot onto the surface of the moon for the very first time. What took place in those extraordinary years was not just a mission. It was the boldest dream humanity had ever dared to chase. So tonight, let go of your thoughts, close your eyes and allow yourself to drift gently back in time, to the era when America reached up and touched the stars. Before we begin tonight's journey, if the calming world of history helps you unwind and drift off to sleep, consider subscribing to History for Sleep, and ring the bell so you never miss a peaceful night of storytelling. Now, let us begin. Close your eyes. Take a long, slow breath in, and let it out gently. Allow your body to sink deeper into wherever you are resting right now. Tonight, we are going to travel back in time, not with urgency, not with rushing, but slowly, peacefully, the way a leaf drifts down from a tall tree on a still autumn afternoon. We are going back to a world that was tense and uncertain and full of fear. And yet, somehow, from all of that heaviness, humanity found a way to look up, to dream, to reach beyond everything it had ever known. It is the middle of the 20th century. The Second Great War of the World has finally ended, leaving behind it a landscape of exhaustion and rebuilding. Cities that had once stood proud and ancient were reduced to rubble. Millions of lives had been lost. The entire human family had been shaken to its very core. And now, in the long quiet that followed the storm, the world was trying to find its footing again. But peace, as it turned out, was not entirely peaceful. Two great powers had emerged from the ashes of that war, and they saw the world, and everything beyond it in very different ways. On one side stood the United States of America, a vast, energetic nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, built on ideals of freedom and democracy, humming with industry and ambition, its people full of optimism and a deep belief in progress. On the other side stood the Soviet Union, an enormous empire of nations stretching across Eurasia, forged in the fires of revolution and hardship, governed by a communist ideology that believed in collective strength, state power, and a very different vision of what the future should look like. These two powers had fought on the same side during the war. But now, with the common enemy gone, they looked at each other across a vast and widening ideological divide. And what they felt was not friendship. It was suspicion. It was competition. It was fear. This period came to be known as the Cold War. It was called cold because the two superpowers never directly fired weapons at each other in open battle. But make no mistake, the tension between them was very real and very intense. It expressed itself in diplomatic standoffs, in covert operations, in the quiet movement of influence across continents and oceans. It expressed itself in the stockpiling of nuclear weapons so powerful that either side could, if it chose, destroy entire cities in a matter of minutes. The world lived beneath that shadow every single day, and people on both sides went to sleep at night knowing that the balance of everything they loved was delicate, held in place by a fragile thread of deterrence and diplomacy. But wars, even cold ones, need battlegrounds. And the battleground that would come to define the middle years of this conflict was not a jungle, not a desert, not a frozen mountain range. It was the sky itself. And beyond the sky, the infinite, silent, star-filled darkness of space. It began, as so many things do, with science born in the shadow of war. During the Second World War, a brilliant and complicated German engineer named Wernher von Braun had developed the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range ballistic missile, when hailed, capable of carrying a payload through the upper atmosphere and delivering it to a target hundreds of miles away. The V-2 was a weapon, and it caused terrible destruction. But it was also something else. It was proof. Proof that human beings could build a machine powerful enough to pierce the boundary between the air we breathe and the void beyond it. Proof that the edge of space was no longer an impossible frontier. It was simply an engineering challenge waiting to be solved. When the war ended, both the Americans and the Soviets understood the significance of what von Braun and his team had created. Both nations moved quickly and quietly to gather as many German rocket scientists as they could, along with their documents, their blueprints, their knowledge. Von Braun himself, along with many of his colleagues, ultimately came to work for the United States, eventually finding a home at what would become NASA. The Soviets, meanwhile, had captured their own share of German rocket technology and expertise, and so both sides began, in the years following the war, to quietly develop their own rocketry programs, officially for scientific purposes, unofficially as part of the broader competition for global dominance. The man who would lead the Soviet rocket program was a figure both extraordinary and largely unknown to the outside world during his lifetime. His name was Sergei Korolev, and he was, by almost any measure, a genius. Born in Ukraine in 1907, Korolev had been fascinated by flight since childhood. He had survived the brutal Soviet purges of the 1930s, spending years in a labor camp before being released to work on military technology during the war. What he had endured would have broken most men. Instead, it seemed to sharpen him, to focus his extraordinary mind with a clarity and determination that made him, in the years that followed, arguably the most important engineer of the 20th century. The Soviets kept his identity a strict state secret, referring to him only as the chief designer, so that if anything went wrong, no single individual could be targeted by enemy intelligence. The world would not learn his name until after his death. Under Korolev's leadership, the Soviet space program made its first extraordinary move on the 4th of October, 1957. On that night, a rocket rose from a launch site in the Kazakh steppe and carried into orbit a small metal sphere about the size of a beach ball, studded with 4 thin antennas, equipped with a simple radio transmitter. Its name was Sputnik, a Russian word meaning roughly fellow traveler, and as it circled the Earth every 96 minutes, broadcasting a steady, quiet beeping signal that amateur radio operators around the world could tune in and hear with their own ears, it changed everything. The reaction in the United States was immediate and profound. There was awe. Certainly, the idea that a human-made object was now orbiting the Earth was genuinely wondrous, something out of science fiction made startlingly real. But there was also fear. If the Soviets could put a satellite into orbit, it meant their rockets were powerful enough to carry a nuclear warhead to any point on Earth. The sky, which Americans had always thought of as a kind of protective ceiling, suddenly felt terrifyingly open. Newspapers ran urgent headlines, congressional hearings were convened, ordinary citizens looked up at the night sky and wondered what it meant that something was up there, circling overhead, put there by a rival power, whose intentions they did not fully trust. Then, just a month later, the Soviets struck again. On the 3rd of November, 1957, they launched Sputnik 2, a much larger spacecraft, and this time carrying a passenger. Her name was Laika, a small stray dog, found on the streets of Moscow, now riding a rocket into the history books. Laika did not survive the mission. The technology to return a living creature from orbit did not yet exist, but her flight proved something of staggering importance. A living being could be launched into space and survive, at least for a time, in the weightless environment beyond Earth's atmosphere. The era of space travel was not just theoretical. It was happening. Right now. The Soviets were doing it. America scrambled to respond. Its own early satellite attempts had been troubled. A highly publicized launch attempt in December 1957 ended in a spectacular and embarrassing failure, the rocket rising only a few feet before collapsing back onto the launch pad in a ball of flame. The press called it Floppanic. It was a humiliating moment for a nation that prided itself on technological achievement. But America did not give up. On the 31st of January 1958, a P-8, the Explorer 1 satellite, was successfully launched into orbit, and with it came not just a measure of relief, but an important scientific discovery: the detection of the Van Allen radiation belts that surround the Earth. America was in the race. Later that same year, in 1958, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act into law, creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. It was a civilian agency, deliberately designed to be open and transparent in contrast to the secretive Soviet program, and it was given a mandate of breathtaking ambition to explore space for the benefit of all humanity. NASA absorbed existing research centers, recruited the best engineers and scientists in the country, and began laying the foundation for everything that will follow. It was a quiet beginning. In many ways, rows of men in white shirts and narrow ties bending over drafting tables and slide rules. But from that quietness, something enormous was being born. The early years of the space race produced achievements and setbacks on both sides in rapid, dizzying succession. The Soviets continued to lead in the most visible milestones. In 1959, their Luna 1 spacecraft became the first human-made object to escape Earth's gravity entirely and travel into deep space. Luna 2 became the first craft to reach the surface of the moon. Luna 3 flew around the far side of the moon and sent back the first photographs of that hidden face, the side that no human eye had ever seen. Each announcement from Moscow sent a fresh ripple of urgency through the American program, and then came the moment that, more than any other, defined the opening chapter of the space race and set the stage for everything that followed. On the 12th of April 1961, a 27-year-old Soviet Air Force pilot named Yuri Gagarin climbed into a small spherical capsule called Vostok 1, was sealed inside, and was launched into orbit around the Earth. The flight lasted 108 minutes. Gagarin circled the globe once, looking out through his small porthole at the blue curve of the Earth below, at the absolute blackness of space above, and reportedly said words to the effect that the Earth was blue and how wonderful it was. Then he re-entered the atmosphere in a ball of fire, ejected from his capsule as planned, and parachuted safely to the ground in a field in southern Russia, where he was found by a startled farmer and her granddaughter. He had become the first human being in history to travel to space and return alive. The world was stunned. In America, the reaction was a complicated mixture of genuine admiration, because Gagarin's courage was undeniable, and his achievement was a triumph for all of humanity, and deep, urgent anxiety. The Soviets had done it again. They had the first satellite, they had the first animal in orbit, and now they had the first human being in space. The pattern was unmistakable, and for a nation that believed in its own exceptionalism, that believed in its destiny as a leader of the free world, the pattern was intolerable. In Washington, a young president was watching very closely. John Fitzgerald Kennedy had taken office just 3 months earlier, full of energy and vision and a rhetoric of bold action. He was already dealing with the aftermath of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, a humiliating early setback for his administration. He needed a win. More than that, he understood, clearly and instinctively, that the space race was not really about space. It was about the hearts and minds of the watching world. It was about which system, democracy or communism, could produce the greater achievements. It was about which flag would fly highest when humanity took its next great step. Kennedy called his advisors together and asked them directly where America could beat the Soviet Union. Not where it was behind, he knew where it was behind. He knew where it was behind, but where it could win. The answer that came back was audacious, almost reckless in its ambition. The moon. Neither nation had the technology to reach the moon yet. If America committed now, fully and without reservation, it might just be able to develop that technology before the Soviets could. It would require an unprecedented investment of money and talent and national will. It would require solving problems that had never been solved before, building machines that had never been built before, training human beings to do things that no human being had ever done. It would be, in the truest sense, a moonshot. And so the stage was set. The sea, old war, that long tense standoff between two visions of the world, had found its most extraordinary expression, not in the stockpiling of weapons, not in the maneuvering of armies, but in the dreams of engineers and the courage of astronauts, and the quiet, burning ambition of a species that had looked up at the night sky for all of its existence and wondered, with a longing too deep for words, what it might feel like to actually go there. The space race had begun in earnest, and somewhere out there, 238,000 miles away, the moon waited, silent, patient, ancient beyond imagining, for the day when human footprints would finally appear upon its surface. Tonight, let that image carry you gently towards sleep. The moon, hanging in the darkness above you right now, the same moon that Gagarin saw from his capsule, the same moon that Kennedy looked up at when he made his promise, the same moon that would one day bear the weight of an American astronaut's boot. It is up there still. And everything that happened to put those footprints there began here, in the rivalry and the fear and the extraordinary human hunger to rise above what had come before. Breathe slowly. Let your thoughts grow quieter. Let the story settle around you like a warm and gentle blanket. There is more to come, but for now, simply rest in the wonder of it. The small, astonishing fact that once upon a time two great nations looked up at the same sky and decided, each in its own way, to try to reach it. Sleep well. The stars are still out there, waiting. Take a slow, deep breath in and let it out softly. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest open and easy. Let the quiet of this moment wrap itself around you like the stillness of a late evening, when the world outside has grown dark and gentle and the only thing that matters is the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing. Tonight we are going to travel back together, back to a specific moment in time, a moment so clear and so powerful that its echo has never really faded. We are going to stand in a great hall, surrounded by thousands of people, beneath the bright lights of a summer day, and we are going to listen to a young man make a promise so bold, so breathtaking, so seemingly impossible, that the entire world stopped to wonder whether he actually meant it. He meant it. The year is 1961. America is a nation caught between confidence and anxiety, between the golden optimism of the post-war years and the creeping unease of a world that feels increasingly uncertain and dangerous. The suburbs are full of new houses and growing families. The highways are full of long, gleaming automobiles. The television sets in living rooms across the country glow with a new kind of cultural life that is still finding its shape and its voice. On the surface, America looks prosperous and powerful and sure of itself, but beneath that surface, something is stirring. A quiet but persistent worry that the future may not belong to American in the way that Americans had always assumed it would. The Soviet Union is the source of much of that worry. In the years since the Second World War, the Soviets have matched America in nuclear capability, have developed their own hydrogen bomb, have built an empire of satellite states across Eastern Europe, and have, most recently and most visibly, demonstrated a series of stunning achievements in space that have left the American public feeling, for the first time in a long time, like the underdog. Sputnik, Laika, Yuri Gagarin. Each milestone has landed like a quiet but unmistakable challenge, and America has felt, with each one, the uncomfortable sensation of falling behind. Into this atmosphere of restless anxiety steps John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He is 40 years old when he takes the oath of office in January of 1961, the youngest man ever elected to the presidency of the United States. He is handsome and quick-witted, possessed of a natural charisma that seems to fill whatever room he enters. He speaks in a clipped Boston accent that carries a sense of urgency and intelligence, and when he talks about America's place in the world, he does so with the conviction of a man who believes, deeply and without reservation, that history is alive, that it is moving right now, and that the choices made in this moment will shape everything that follows. Kennedy comes to the presidency carrying the weight of enormous expectations. His inaugural address has already entered the realm of legend, with its soaring call to service and sacrifice, its declaration that the torch has been passed to a new generation, its famous challenge to ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. America has responded to that speech with genuine excitement, a sense that something new and vital is beginning, that the sleepy caution of the Eisenhower years is giving way to something bolder and more alive. The country is ready to be inspired. It is ready, in some deep and unspoken way, to be asked to do something great. But the early weeks and months of Kennedy's presidency are not easy ones. In April of 1961, just 3 months after he takes office, the administration suffers a devastating and humiliating foreign policy failure. A group of Cuban exiles, trained and equipped by the CIA, attempts to invade Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs, with the goal of overthrowing the communist government of Fidel Castro. The operation is a catastrophe from almost the first moment. The invaders are quickly overwhelmed. The expected popular uprising against Castro never materializes, and within days the whole enterprise collapses in confusion and recrimination. Kennedy takes public responsibility for the failure, as a president must, and in doing so he absorbs a blow to his prestige and credibility that he knows he cannot afford to let stand for long. And then, just days after the Bay of Pigs disaster, comes Yuri Gagarin's flight. The first human being in space, and he is Soviet. The timing could not be worse for Kennedy, and he knows it. He meets with his advisors in a mood of genuine urgency, pacing and questioning and pushing, trying to find a path forward. He asks James Webb, the newly appointed administrator of NASA, and his Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who has long been an advocate for the space program, where America stands. The answer is not comfortable. In almost every category of space achievement, the Soviets are ahead. Their rockets are more powerful. Their program has already achieved more firsts. If the competition continues on its current trajectory, there is every reason to believe the Soviets will continue to lead. But Kennedy is not interested in the current trajectory. He is interested in where a new trajectory might lead. He asks his team to think not about where America is losing, but about where America could win, where there is still a race to be run that neither side has yet won. And the answer, when it comes, is simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. The moon. No one has been to the moon. No one has even come close to the moon. The technology required to send human beings to the moon and return them safely to Earth does not yet fully exist on either side. It would need to be invented, piece by piece, through years of relentless work and problem solving. But if America committed to that goal now, fully, publicly, with all of the resources and will and genius the nation could bring to bear, it might just be possible to get there first. Kennedy turns the idea over carefully. He is not a scientist or an engineer, but he is a man of sharp and penetrating intelligence, and he understands both the technical challenge and the political opportunity with equal clarity. A commitment to land on the moon would be, above all else, a statement of national character. It would tell the world, tell the watching nations of Africa and Asia and Latin America, that both superpowers were competing to influence, that America was not retreating, was not afraid, was not content to follow. It would reframe the entire contest between democracy and communism in terms that were vivid and dramatic and impossible to ignore. And it would give the American people something to believe in, something to work toward. A horizon grand enough to lift the national spirit out of the shadows of Bay of Pigs and Sputnik and all the small accumulated anxieties of the Cold War years. On the 25th of May, 1961, Kennedy stands before a joint session of Congress and delivers a special message on urgent national needs. The speech covers a range of topics: civil defense, foreign aid, military spending. But it is one passage, delivered about halfway through, that will be remembered long after everything else has faded. His voice is steady and clear. He has clearly thought carefully about these words, has weighed them and tested them against his own sense of what is true and what is possible. And then he says them. He tells Congress, and through Congress, the American people, and through the American people, the watching world, that he believes the nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before the decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. He does not hedge. He does not qualify. He does not say perhaps, or if resources allow or subject to further study. He says before the decade is out. He says landing a man on the moon. He says returning him safely to the earth. Every word is chosen with precision, and together they form a sentence of extraordinary boldness, a public promise of a kind that presidents almost never make, because public promises of this kind can be broken, and broken promises are the currency of political weakness. Kennedy knows this. He makes the promise anyway, because he understands something that his more cautious advisors perhaps do not fully appreciate, that there are moments in history when boldness is not just desirable, but necessary, when the only way to move forward is to commit so publicly and so completely that turning back becomes more costly than pressing on. By speaking those words before Congress, before the cameras, before the world, Kennedy is not just setting a goal. He is creating an irreversible momentum. He is making the moon mission not a program that future administrations can quietly defund or redirect, but a national promise, a matter of American honor, a commitment woven into the fabric of the country's self-image. The reaction to the speech is immediate and complex. In the halls of Congress there is applause, but also a great deal of private uncertainty. Do we actually know how to do this? The honest answer among those who know the most about the state of American rocketry in May of 1961 is that no, not really, not yet. Alan Shepard has just become the first American in space. Just 15 days before Kennedy's speech, a flight that lasted 15 minutes and reached a maximum altitude of about 116 miles. Nowhere near orbit, nothing even remotely close to the moon. The gap between where America is on that day and where Kennedy is saying it needs to be by December 31st, 1969, is almost incomprehensibly large. It is the equivalent of a person who has just learned to swim announcing that they will cross the Atlantic Ocean before the end of the decade. But that is also, in a way, the point. Kennedy is not announcing a program. He is announcing a transformation. He is calling on America to become something it has not yet been, to develop capabilities it does not yet have, to solve problems it has not yet have, to solve problems it has not yet even fully defined. He is betting, with extraordinary confidence, on the creative and technical genius of the American people, on the ability of free institutions to mobilize talent and resources toward a common goal, on the fundamental human capacity to do what has never been done before when the stakes are high enough and the will is strong enough. In the months that follow, the machinery of that transformation begins to move. NASA, which at the time of Kennedy's speech employs around 10,000 people, begins a period of explosive growth. New facilities are planned and built. The Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, Texas, which will become the nerve center of the human spaceflight program, and the massive vehicle assembly building at Cape Canaveral in Florida, one of the largest buildings by volume ever constructed, tall enough that clouds sometimes form inside it on humid days. Universities across the country see a surge in enrollment in engineering and physics and mathematics programs, as a generation of young Americans is inspired by the president's call to reach for the moon. Companies large and small begin competing for NASA contracts, knowing that the work ahead will require manufacturing of a precision and complexity the world has never seen. Kennedy himself remains deeply engaged with the space program throughout his presidency, more than his public statements perhaps suggest. In private, he has moments of doubt. He is in many ways less personally captivated by space exploration for its own sake than he is strategically committed to it as a tool of Cold War competition. There is a famous recording of a private White House meeting in which Kennedy, in unguarded conversation with NASA Administrator James Webb, speaks with striking candor about his priorities. He is not interested in space, he says, in quite the same way Webb is. He is interested in beating the Soviets. The moon mission is the means by which America demonstrates its superiority, and if there were a better means, he would use that instead. This candor is important to understand, because it reveals something essential about the nature of great historical commitments. They are rarely born from pure idealism alone. Kennedy's moon promise is driven by geopolitical calculation, by wounded national pride, by the instincts of a gifted politician who knows how to read the mood of his country and the world. And yet, and this is what makes it remarkable, From those very human and very political motivations, something genuinely transcendent emerges. The moon mission, launched for reasons of Cold War strategy, becomes one of the greatest adventures in the history of the human species. The promise made in that congressional chamber, motivated at least in part by competition and anxiety, and the need to restore American prestige, ends up expanding the boundaries of what human beings believe they can do. It inspires a generation. It produces discoveries and technologies that change the world. It gives humanity a moment. One single, unforgettable moment in July of 1969. Of almost universal shared wonder, but all of that is still years away. For now, on this May evening in 1961, the promise has simply been made. It hangs in the air, enormous and shimmering, part challenge and part dream and part prayer. Across America, in living rooms and laboratories and schoolrooms, people are turning it over in their minds, testing its edges, trying to feel the full weight of what has been said. Before the Rana, this being said, before the Rada, decade is out, a man on the moon returns safely to the Earth. In Huntsville, Alabama, Werner von Braun, the German rocket engineer who once built weapons for a regime he later claimed to have despised, and who now directs the Army's rocket program with evangelical passion, hears this speech and feels the ground shift beneath him. This is what he has been working toward his entire life. This is the moment when the dream becomes real. In the Soviet Union, the reaction is a complicated mix of dismissal and private alarm. Publicly, Soviet officials mock the Americans for their ambition, suggesting that Kennedy's promise is mere propaganda. Privately, the leaders of the Soviet space program understand that the race has just changed. The stakes have been raised in a way that cannot be ignored, and somewhere above all of them, somewhere above all of them, above the politicians and the engineers and the cold warriors and the dreamers, the moon hangs in the night sky, patient and indifferent and ancient, as it has always hung, as it will always hang, illuminating the darkness with its borrowed light, waiting quietly for the day when the small, ambitious, extraordinary creatures on the blue planet below will finally find a way to come to it. Tonight, let that patience of the moon settle into you. Let it slow your breathing and soften your thoughts. The world is full of bold promises and long journeys, and the quiet courage it takes to keep going when the goal seems impossibly far away. But sometimes, just sometimes, the promise is kept. Sometimes the impossible journey is completed. Sometimes the decade ends, and the footprints are there, in the dust of another world. And everything that seemed like dreaming turns out to have been something more. Rest now. Let the story carry you gently towards sleep. The moon is outside tonight, as it always is. And it remembers. Breathe in slowly, and breathe out. Let the tension of the day dissolve with each exhale, drifting away like smoke on a still evening breeze. Let your body grow heavy and warm and comfortable, sinking deeper into the softness beneath you. There is nothing you need to do right now, nothing you need to solve or decide or remember. There is only this, the quiet and the dark, and a gentle story waiting to carry you away. Tonight we are not going to talk about the grand, dramatic gestures of history. We are not going to speak of speeches that shook the world or moments that stopped every television set in every living room in America. Tonight we are going to talk about something quieter than that, and in many ways more beautiful. We are going to talk about the long, patient, unglamorous work of preparation, about the people who showed up every single day and did the difficult, careful, often invisible work that makes the extraordinary possible. We are going to talk about the programs that most people today have half forgotten. The programs that came before the moon, that built the road that led to the moon one careful, steady mile at a time. Before any American astronaut could dream of walking on the surface of another world, someone had to answer a question that sounds almost embarrassingly simple, but was, in the early 1960s, genuinely and profoundly unknown. Could a human being survive in space at all? Not just for 15 minutes as Alan Shepard had demonstrated in his brief arcing flight above the atmosphere, but for hours, for days, for the length of time it would take to travel to the moon and back, roughly 8 days. There and home again. 8 days spent weightless and sealed inside a small metal capsule, farther from the Earth than any human being had ever been. Nobody knew, with certainty, what that experience would do to a human body. Nobody knew what it would do to a human mind. The doctors and scientists had theories, some of them encouraging and some of them deeply worrying. But theories are not the same as knowledge, and when you are planning to send human beings into an environment that has never been tested by human experience, theories are not enough. This is where it all began, not with rockets and countdowns and the roar of engines, but with questions. Careful, methodical, relentless questions, asked by engineers and physicians, and physiologists and psychologists, who understood that the only way to get to the moon was to first understand as completely as possible the nature of the challenge that lay ahead. The Mercury and Gemini programs were, at their heart, laboratories, moving laboratories, launched into the sky, one careful experiment at a time. Each mission designed to answer a specific set of questions and return with the data needed to plan the next step. They were quiet programs, in the sense that they lacked the singular dramatic climax of Apollo. But they were not small, they were not simple, and without them Apollo would have been not a triumph but a tragedy. The Mercury program was born almost simultaneously with NASA itself, formally announced in 1958 and named for the swift messenger of the Roman gods. It was a program defined above all else by constraint. The technology available in the late 1950s placed strict limits on what was possible, and the Mercury engineers, working under intense pressure, acutely aware that the Soviets were racing ahead, designed their spacecraft and missions accordingly. The Mercury capsule was tiny, barely large enough to contain a single astronaut in a seated position, a metal cone about 6 feet wide at its base, crammed with instruments and life support systems and the dozens of small mechanisms required to keep a human being alive at the edge of space. The astronauts who flew it sometimes joked that you did not climb into a Mercury capsule so much as strap it on, like a piece of very elaborate clothing. The men chosen to fly these capsules were announced to the world in April of 1959, and their arrival on the public stage was one of the defining moments of the early space age. There were 7 of them: Scott Carpenter, Gordon Cooper, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, and Dex Slayton, and they were, in almost every measurable way, exceptional human beings. All were military test pilots with thousands of hours of flight time in the most advanced aircraft of their era. All were physically and psychologically robust in ways that had been tested and verified through a battery of examinations so exhaustive and invasive that the astronauts themselves later described the selection process with a mixture of pride and wry humor. They were brave without being reckless, competitive without being destructive, confident without being arrogant, or at least, that was the image carefully cultivated for the American public, which took these 7 men immediately and completely to its heart. The Mercury 7, as they came to be known, became something that America desperately needed in those anxious years of Cold War tension. They became heroes, not the heroes of mythology or legend, remote and superhuman, but heroes of a recognizable and accessible kind. They had families and mortgages and favorite football teams. They laughed at press conferences and spoke plainly about the risks they were taking. Life magazine had purchased the exclusive rights to their personal stories, and its pages were full of photographs of astronauts mowing lawns and wives making breakfast and children playing in backyards that looked like every backyard in America. This was deliberate and carefully managed, but it was also, in its way, genuine. These were real men doing something genuinely extraordinary, and the country's love for them was real. Before any of the 7 flew, however, the Mercury capsule was tested with other passengers. Rhesus monkeys named Sam and Miss Sam made brief suborbital flights to test the life support systems. A chimpanzee named Ham, trained through months of patient conditioning to respond to lights and levers, flew a full suborbital mission in January of 1961 and returned safely, providing crucial data about how a living creature performed basic cognitive tasks under the stresses of launch and weightlessness. Hans' flight was not glamorous. It was not the stuff of legend, but it was essential, and the data it returned directly shaped the mission parameters for Alan Shepard's flight. Just 4 months later, Shepard's flight, on the 5th of May, 1961, was in many ways a modest achievement by comparison to what Gagarin had done 3 weeks before, where Gagarin had orbited the Earth for nearly 2 hours. Shepard's Freedom 7 mission followed a simple arc, up and over, reaching a peak altitude of about 116 miles before descending and splashing down in the Atlantic Ocean 15 minutes and 22 seconds after launch. He did not orbit. He did not experience extended weightlessness. But he was an American, and he was alive, and he had gone to space and come back, and the country received him with a joy and relief that said everything about how much those 15 minutes had meant. President Kennedy watched the launch on television in the Oval Office and was visibly moved. The program was working. The road was being built. Over the following 2 years, Mercury flew 5 more crewed missions, each one carefully designed to extend what had been learned from the last. Gus Grissom repeated Shepard's suborbital flight in July of 1961, and though the mission itself was successful, the aftermath brought the first real moment of crisis. The hatch of his Liberty Bell 7 capsule blew open unexpectedly after splashdown, flooding the capsule and nearly drowning Grissom before he was recovered by helicopter. The capsule sank to the bottom of the Atlantic, not to be recovered until decades later. The investigation into the hatch failure was meticulous and unsparing, because that was the culture NASA was trying to build, a culture in which every failure was examined without defensiveness, every lesson extracted and applied. Because in this business the cost of unlearned lessons was paid in human lives. John Glenn's flight, in February of 1962, was the mission that truly captured America's imagination, the one that felt less like a technical experiment and more like a defining national moment. Glenn, who had the natural bearing and the easy, unaffected decency of a man from central casting for the role of American hero, became the first American to orbit the Earth, circling the globe 3 times over nearly 5 hours in his Friendship 7 capsule. The country essentially stopped to watch. Schools canceled classes, businesses sent employees home. Crowds gathered in public squares to watch the coverage on portable televisions. When Glenn splashed down safely in the Atlantic and was recovered by the destroyer Noah, the relief and joy that swept across America were almost physical in their intensity. Kennedy flew to Cape Canaveral to congratulate him personally. Glenn was given a ticker tape parade in New York City that drew 4 million people, more than had turned out for Eisenhower's victory parade after the Second World War. But even as Glenn was being celebrated, the engineers and flight directors at NASA were already looking ahead, already adding the next layer to the foundation they were building. The Mercury program had answered its central question. Yes, human beings could survive in speed. ACE could function and think and work in the weightless environment beyond the atmosphere. But it had raised a dozen new questions that would need to be answered before anyone could think seriously about going to the moon. Could astronauts operate effectively during spacewalks, working outside their capsule in the void? Could 2 spacecraft find each other in orbit and dock together? A maneuver that would be absolutely essential for any moon mission? Could the human body tolerate spaceflight for the duration of a lunar voyage? 8 days or more? Could astronauts develop the precise manual control skills needed to navigate in space, to adjust their orbit, to find a specific point in the sky, and fly to it with the accuracy of a surgeon? Mercury could not answer these questions. A new program was needed, one that could bridge the gap between the modest achievements of the early space age and the enormous complexity of a moon landing. That program was Gemini, named for the twin stars of the constellation. Gemini was designed from the beginning to be a program of firsts, a deliberate, methodical accumulation of the specific capabilities that Apollo would require. The Gemini capsule was larger than Mercury, carrying 2 astronauts instead of 1, and it was equipped with maneuvering thrusters that gave the crew genuine control over their orbit, something Mercury had not had. The program would fly 10 crewed missions between 1965 and 1966, each one targeted at a specific set of objectives, each one adding another piece to the puzzle that Apollo needed to complete. The first great challenge Gemini addressed was duration. If astronauts were going to travel to the moon and back, they needed to be able to survive in space for at least 8 days. Gemini 4 flown in June of 1965 by Gemini 65. By Gemini 5 flown by Gordon Cooper and Pete Conrad. Flown by Gordon Cooper and Pete Conrad in August of 1965, pushed the duration to 8 full days, precisely the length of a lunar mission, and both astronauts returned in good health, demonstrating that the human body could endure the rigors of extended spaceflight without catastrophic deterioration. The data gathered on bone density and muscle mass and cardiovascular function and sleep patterns and nutrition filled hundreds of pages and informed every subsequent mission plan. It was quiet, unglamorous, essential work, and the two men who did it landed with almost no fanfare compared to what Glenn had received 3 years earlier, because by now success was becoming expected, and the expected is quickly taken for granted. Ed White's spacewalk during Gemini 4 was anything but taken for granted. On the third orbit of the mission, White opened his hatch and floated out into space, becoming the first American to perform an extravehicular activity, to exist unsupported in the vacuum outside the spacecraft, tethered by a slender gold umbilical cord, propelling himself with a small handheld maneuvering gun. He floated above the Earth at 17,000 miles per hour, and later described it as the most natural feeling he had ever experienced, as though the universe had been waiting for him to arrive. He stayed outside for 23 minutes, and when McDivitt finally told him it was time to come back in, White said it was the saddest moment of his life. The photographs taken of White during his spacewalk, a white-suited figure against the impossible blue of the Earth, the blackness of space above, the golden cord connecting him to the capsule, became some of the most iconic images of the entire space age. Gemini also had to solve the problem of rendezvous and docking, the ability of two separate spacecraft to find each other in orbit and join together. This was not a simple problem. Orbital metony, CS, is counterintuitive in ways that confound common sense. To catch up with a spacecraft ahead of you, you do not thrust forward, you thrust downward, dropping into a lower, faster orbit, and allow the physics of gravity to bring you around. The mathematics required to calculate these maneuvers precisely, to find a specific point in space moving at thousands of miles per hour and intercept it without collision, demanded a level of computational precision and pilot skill that had never previously existed. Gemini crews practiced these maneuvers mission after mission, building the understanding and the muscle memory that Apollo crews would need. Gemini 8, flown by Neil Armstrong and David Scott, in March of 1966, achieved the first successful docking between two spacecraft in orbit, a milestone so critical to the moon mission that without it, Apollo would have been technically impossible. Through all of these missions, through all of the technical achievements, and the carefully logged data, and the slowly accumulating confidence that yes, this can be done, the men of Mercury and Gemini were doing something else as well. They were learning who they were in space. They were discovering the particular quality of courage required not for the sudden sharp test of combat or emergency, but for the long sustained test of days spent in a metal capsule far from everything familiar, dependent on technology and teamwork, and the quiet reserves of your own inner life. They were finding out what it meant to be human in a place where no human had ever been, to look out through a small window at the curve of the Earth, to watch the sun rise 16 times in a single day, to float in weightlessness and feel the absence of gravity as both liberation and strangeness, to know that the thin wall beside your shoulder is the only thing standing between you and a void of absolute cold and absolute silence. What those men brought back from space, not the data, not the technical knowledge, but the inner understanding, the changed perspective, the bone-deep sense of the Earth's beauty and fragility seen from outside it, was perhaps the most important thing the Mercury and Gemini programs produced. It was knowledge that could not be put in a report or expressed in a measurement. It was the knowledge of what it felt like to be there, and it lived in the memories and the words of the men who carried it back with them. And through their words it was passed on to a world that was beginning, slowly and imperfectly, to understand what it had asked these men to do on its behalf. By the end of 1966, the Gemini program was complete. 10 missions, 10 crews returned safely to Earth. The questions had been answered, the capabilities demonstrated. The road laid down one careful mile at a time. The next mission would carry the name of the first letter of the Greek alphabet. It would be called Apollo, and it would carry with it everything that Mercury and Gemini had built. Every hour of training, every page of data, every hour of training, every page of data, every lesson learned from every success and every failure, toward the destination that a young president had promised the world would be reached before the decade was out. The moon was waiting, and now, for the first time, America was truly ready to go. Let that readiness settle into you now, like the deep breath before a long and peaceful sleep. All the quiet preparation, all the patient, unglamorous, essential work of getting ready. There is beauty in that kind of readiness, in the long road that leads, one steady step at a time, to the place where the extraordinary becomes possible. Breathe, slowly. Let your thoughts grow soft and distant. Let this story carry you down into the warm dark of sleep, where the stars are close and the earth is blue, and the moon hangs overhead like a promise waiting to be kept. Rest now. You have earned it. Breathe in slowly and breathe out. Let the weight of the day lift away from you, gently and completely, the way morning mist lifts from a quiet lake as the sun rises soft and unhurried above the horizon. Let your body settle, let your mind grow still. There is nothing pressing here, nothing urgent, nothing that cannot wait until morning. There is only the darkness and the quiet and the soft sound of your own, breathing steady and slow and reliable as the turning of the earth. Tonight we are going to walk together through one of the most difficult chapters in the story of America's journey to the moon. It is not an easy story. It carries grief in it and loss, and the particular kind of sorrow that comes when brave people pay the highest possible price for a dream they believed in completely. But it is also a story about something else, about resilience and honesty, and the extraordinary human capacity to look clearly at failure, to absorb its lessons without flinching, and to find the courage to continue. It is a story about what it truly costs to reach for something great. And in its own quiet way, it is a story about love. The love of 3 men for their work, for their country, and for the sky they gave their lives trying to reach. The year is 1967. America is changing in ways that are not entirely comfortable. The optimism of the early Kennedy years has been complicated by the deepening wound of Vietnam, by the turbulence of the civil rights movement, by the growing sense among many Americans that the country is engaged in struggles it does not fully know how to resolve. Kennedy himself has been gone for more than 3 years now, cut down in Dallas on a November afternoon that left the nation stunned and bereaved in ways it is still processing. His successor, Lyndon Johnson, has pursued the moon program with genuine commitment, understanding as Kennedy did that it represents something larger than itself, a statement of national capability and national character at a moment when both are being questioned. NASA's budget in the mid-1960s is at its historic peak, consuming nearly 5% of the entire federal budget, employing directly or indirectly hundreds of thousands of people across the country. The program is enormous and fast-moving and full of the particular energy of people who believe they are doing something that matters. The Apollo spacecraft is the most complex machine human beings have ever attempted to build. Where the Mercury capsule had been a simple cone barely large enough for one person, and the Gemini capsule a somewhat larger vessel for 2, the Apollo Command Module is a sophisticated multi-room vehicle designed to support 3 astronauts for up to 2 weeks, equipped with navigation computers, life support systems, propulsion systems, communications arrays, and hundreds of thousands of individual components, each one of which needs to work correctly, in sequence, under conditions of extreme stress and temperature and radiation. The engineering challenge is staggering, and the pace at which it is being pursued, driven by Kennedy's end-of-decade deadline, by the competition with the Soviets, by the sheer institutional momentum of a program that has absorbed billions of dollars and the working lives of hundreds of thousands of people, means that corners are sometimes cut, that problems are sometimes noted and not immediately resolved, that the pressure to move forward sometimes outweighs the instinct to slow down and make sure everything is truly ready. The men assigned to fly the first crewed Apollo mission are three of the most experienced astronauts in the program. Gus Grissom is the mission commander, a compact, quietly intense man from Mitchell, Indiana, a veteran of both Mercury and Gemini who has more spaceflight experience than almost anyone in the astronaut corps. He is not the most publicly celebrated of the astronauts now. He lacks Glenn's easy charm and Shepard's aristocratic bearing. But among his colleagues and the engineers who work with him, he is deeply respected for his technical knowledge, his pilot's instincts, and his absolute refusal to accept anything less than his best. He has been in difficult situations before. During the Gemini 3 mission, he became the first person to manually maneuver a spacecraft in orbit, demonstrating the precise control that later missions would build on. He is serious about his work in the way that only people who truly understand its stakes can be serious. Ed White is the senior pilot. And if any single member of the Apollo 1 crew has captured the public imagination in the years leading up to this mission, it is White. His spacewalk during Gemini 4 has made him a figure of almost mythic grace. The man who floated above the Earth on a golden tether and said it was the saddest moment of his life when they asked him to come back inside. He is tall and athletic and possessed of a warmth that makes everyone around him feel slightly more at ease. And he carries the experience of having been outside the spacecraft, of having felt the void directly against the thin fabric of his suit, with a kind of quiet authority that his crewmates recognize and respect. Roger Chaffee is the youngest of the three, a Navy pilot from Grand Rapids, Michigan, on his first spaceflight assignment. He is 29 years old, new enough to the program that he still has the particular brightness of someone who cannot quite believe his good fortune in being here, in being chosen, in being part of this extraordinary thing. He is careful and diligent and eager in the way that young people are eager when they are doing exactly what they were meant to do. He has spent months learning every system on the Apollo command module with a thoroughness that impresses even the veteran engineers. He is ready. He has made himself ready. Whatever comes next, Roger Chaffee is prepared to meet it. What comes next is something none of them could have prepared for, because it comes not in space, where the dangers are understood and anticipated and trained for, but on the ground, in a routine test, in a moment when every indicator says that nothing dangerous is happening at all. The 27th of January 1967 is a Friday, at Cape Kennedy in Florida, the launch site that has borne this name since the assassination, the name that will quietly revert to Cape Canaveral years later. The Apollo 1 crew is conducting what is called a plugs-out test. It is a rehearsal, essentially, a full simulation of the countdown and launch sequence with the spacecraft sitting on the launch pad but with all external power disconnected, running entirely on its own internal systems. There are no propellants loaded. There is no rocket fuel. By every standard definition of the word, this is not a dangerous situation. The test is so routine, so apparently benign, that the launch pad fire suppression systems have not been armed. Inside the command module, the three astronauts are suited and strapped in, going through the procedures they have rehearsed hundreds of times, communicating with the launch control team through their headsets. The test has been troubled throughout the day by minor problems. A strange odor in the oxygen system that has been investigated and tentatively cleared, persistent communications difficulties that have frustrated everyone involved, small irritations of the kind that accumulate in complex technique, operations and wear on the patience of even the most experienced crews. Grissom, characteristically blunt, has expressed his frustration through the communications loop. "How," he asks at one point, "are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings?" It is the kind of question that carries both humor and genuine concern. The kind of question a man asks when he is tired and a little exasperated, but fundamentally committed to getting this right. At 31 minutes past 6 in the evening, with the test still ongoing and the countdown clock temporarily halted while the communications issues are worked through, a voltage surge passes through the electrical system of the command module. In the hours and days and weeks of investigation that follow the events of this evening, the precise point of origin will be difficult to determine with certainty. There are so many wires, so many connections, so many places where insulation has been abraded by repeated bending or damaged by the edges of the equipment it passes through. But somewhere in that dense nest of wiring, in an environment that has been filled with pure oxygen at slightly above atmospheric pressure, a decision made years earlier to simplify the life support system, but one whose implications are now about to become devastatingly clear. A spark ignites. Pure oxygen is not like the air we breathe. Air is about 21% oxygen, mixed with nitrogen and other gases that moderate its behavior. Pure oxygen is something else entirely, an environment in which materials that would burn slowly or not at all in ordinary air become extraordinarily flammable, in which fire spreads not in the way we are used to thinking of fire spreading, but with a speed and ferocity that bears almost no relationship to our everyday experience of flame. In the pure oxygen atmosphere of the Apollo 1 command module, the fire that begins in that tangle of wiring does not smolder or creep. It erupts. Within seconds, the interior of the capsule is engulfed. The temperature rises to levels that begin to compromise the integrity of the spacecraft's structure almost immediately. The three astronauts, strapped into their couches, have almost no time to respond, though the voice recorders and the telemetry data recovered afterward suggest that they were aware of what was happening, that there were words spoken in those terrible seconds, words of alarm and effort and the instinct to act that does not abandon brave people even at the very end. Grissom and White attempt to open the hatch. The hatch on the Apollo command module opens inward, and the pressure inside the capsule, rapidly rising as the fire consumes the oxygen, makes it impossible to open against that pressure. In 17 seconds from the first indication of fire to the rupture of the capsule wall, it is over. Outside the spacecraft, the pad crew responds with desperate urgency, but the heat and the toxic smoke pouring from the capsule make approach nearly impossible. It takes 5 minutes. 5 agonizing minutes to open the hatch from the outside. By then, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee are gone. The first American astronauts to die in a spacecraft had never left the ground. The news reaches the wider world that evening and lands with the force of something almost unimaginable. NASA has lost people before. Test pilots have always understood that their profession carries mortal risk. But this is different. This is not a crash during a test flight in the desert. This is not the sudden mechanical failure of an experimental aircraft pushing into unknown aerodynamic territory. This is 3 men, in a capsule on a launch pad, doing a routine test, killed by a fire that should never have happened. The shock is enormous. And beneath the shock for those within the program who understand enough to ask the question, there is something worse than shock. There is the dawning recognition that this did not have to happen, that the conditions which made it possible had been visible, had been noted, had been discussed, and had not been adequately addressed. The investigation that follows is thorough and unflinching in the way that the best of NASA has always been thorough and unflinching. In the tradition of a program that has always understood that the only way to honor the risks its people take is to understand those risks completely and never look away from failure. The findings are deeply uncomfortable. The wiring in the command module is found to be in far worse condition than anyone had acknowledged. Abraded, poorly routed, riddled with potential failure points. The use of pure oxygen in the cabin atmosphere at launch, a decision that had been made early in the program and never seriously revisited, is identified as a critical vulnerability. The hatch design, which opens inward and cannot be opened quickly from the inside, is fundamentally incompatible with emergency escape. And underlying all of these specific technical failures is something more systemic and more troubling. A culture within the program and its contractors in which the pressure to meet schedule and stay on budget has been allowed, in places, to override the rigorous attention to safety that work of this kind demands. North American Aviation, the contractor that has built the command module, comes under intense scrutiny. The relationship between NASA and North American has been troubled for some time. There have been internal reviews and critical reports that have identified problems with the spacecraft's design and manufacture. Reports that have been received, noted, and not act head-on with sufficient urgency. The people who wrote those reports, who raised those concerns, who tried to slow things down enough to get them right, they are not vindicated by what has happened, because vindication is a cold and empty thing when the cost of being right is paid in lives. But their warnings are now impossible to ignore, and the investigation gives them a weight and an authority they should always have. Congress holds hearings. NASA Administrator James Webb, who has built the agency from its earliest days, and who carries enormous personal and institutional pride in what it has achieved, testifies under circumstances of profound difficulty, defending the program's record while acknowledging the failures that this accident has exposed. The hearings are sometimes harsh and sometimes political and sometimes genuinely searching, as good congressional oversight should be, and they force a reckoning not just with the specific technical failures of Apollo 1, but with the broader question of whether NASA has grown too fast, taken on too much, allowed the pressure of the moon deadline to compromise the careful, methodical, safety-first culture that made the early program successful. The answer, honestly confronted, is yes. In some ways and in some places it has, and the fire has made it impossible to pretend otherwise. What follows is something that, in retrospect, stands as one of the most remarkable institutional responses to disaster in the history of human technological endeavor. NASA does not collapse. It does not abandon the program or surrender to the grief and the shame of what has happened. Instead, it does the hardest thing. It stops. It pauses the entire crewed spaceflight program, grounds every mission, and turns its full attention to understanding exactly what went wrong and fixing it, completely and without compromise, before any American asked. Ronald is put at risk again. The command module is essentially rebuilt. The wiring is replaced and rerouted with new standards of insulation and protection that make the previous installation look almost careless by comparison. The hatch is redesigned from the ground up. The new hatch opens outward, can be opened from the inside in less than 10 seconds, and is one of the most carefully engineered components on the redesigned spacecraft. The cabin atmosphere is changed. Pure oxygen at launch is replaced with a mixed oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, transitioning to pure oxygen only once the spacecraft reaches the lower pressure environment of orbit, where the fire risk is dramatically reduced. Thousands of individual components are examined, tested, and where necessary replaced. The redesign takes 20 months, during which the moon deadline, the end of the decade, the promise Kennedy made in 1961, grows closer with every passing week. There are people within NASA who wonder, quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, whether the deadline can be met. There are people outside the program who suggest that perhaps it should not be met, that rushing toward the moon was what caused this disaster, and that no deadline is worth 3 more lives. These are not unreasonable thoughts, and they deserve the serious consideration they receive. But the people at the heart of the program, the engineers and the flight directors and the astronauts themselves, including the widows of Grissom and White and Chaffee, who carry their grief with a dignity that humbles everyone who witnesses it. These people believe that the best way to honor what has been lost is to finish what was started, to take the lessons of the fire and build something from them that is worthy of the men who died, to make the spacecraft safe enough that when astronauts climb into it and the hatch is sealed behind them, the work that was done in those 20 months of painful rebuilding is itself a kind of tribute. 3 men went into that capsule on a January evening, believing in what they were doing, believing it was worth whatever it cost. They were right. The cost was higher than anyone wanted to pay, and the grief of it never fully leaves the story. But the program they gave their lives for went on, made stronger and more careful, and more honest by the fire that took them. When Neil Armstrong steps onto the surface of the moon 2.5 years later, he carries with him the names of Grissom and White and Chaffee, as every astronaut who follows carries them, quietly, in the way that the living always carry the ones who showed them what dedication truly looks like. Let that quiet carrying settle over you now. Let the weight of this story rest gently on your heart, not as sorrow, but as the particular warmth that comes from knowing that people have given their best to something larger than themselves. The darkness outside your window is the same darkness those 3 men looked up at and dreamed of reaching. They reached for it with everything they had. Breathe slowly. Let your body grow heavy and still. Let the night hold you softly, as it holds everything, in its vast and patient dark. Sleep well. The stars remember their names. Breathe in slowly and let it out, long and soft and easy. Let your body release everything it has been holding today. Every small tension, every unfinished thought, every quiet worry that has been sitting in the corners of your mind. Let all of it drift away now, gently and completely, like leaves carried off by a slow and peaceful river. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing you need to do. There is only this warm darkness and the sound of your own breathing, and a story so extraordinary, so quietly magnificent, that it still feels, real than half a century later, like something that could only have happened in a dream. Except that it did not happen in a dream. It happened in the real world, in the real sky, on a real summer night in 1969. And it happened because thousands of ordinary human beings worked for years with extraordinary dedication, and because 3 men climbed into a rocket and trusted all of that work completely, and because the moon, ancient and patient and silver white above the earth, was finally, after all the long years of reaching, within human grasp. The summer of 1969 is a summer unlike any other in living memory. The world is loud and complicated and full of conflict. Vietnam is tearing at the fabric of American society. Cities have burned in the heat of racial tension. The decade that began with such bright promise has accumulated so much grief and division and loss that many people have grown tired in a deep and bone-level way. And yet, cutting through all of that noise like a single clear note held perfectly in the middle of a storm, there is this: America is going to the moon. In days, not weeks. The rocket is built. The crew is chosen. The calculations have been made and checked again. Everything that Mercury and Gemini and the painful lessons of Apollo 1 have built toward is about to arrive at its destination. After 8 years of work and sacrifice and unimaginable complexity, the moment is almost here. The 3 men who will make this journey are, in many ways, a study in contrasts. Neil Armstrong is the mission commander, and he is perhaps the most quietly extraordinary person in the entire astronaut corps. A man so self-contained, so genuinely modest, so completely uninterested in the kind of public heroism that the culture of the era tends to project onto people in his position, that some people mistake his reticence for coldness. They are wrong. Armstrong is not cold. He is simply someone who has always found the work itself more interesting than the attention the work attracts, someone whose inner life is rich and private, and not easily translated into the sound bites and the handshakes that the world wants from its heroes. He grew up in Wapakoneta, Ohio, a small town in the flat Midwestern landscape, and fell in love with flying before he was old enough to drive a car. He earned his pilot's license at 16 before he had his driver's license. He flew combat missions in Korea. He became one of the most skilled and courageous test pilots in the country, flying the X-15 rocket plane to the edge of space before joining the astronaut program. He is, by any measure, one of the finest pilots who has ever lived. And he is deeply, genuinely ambivalent about the fame that is about to descend on him. Buzz Aldrin is the lunar module pilot, and where Armstrong is quiet and inward, Aldrin is more openly intellectual, more willing to engage with the philosophical dimensions of what they are doing, more comfortable speaking about the experience in terms that reach beyond the technical. He has a doctorate in astronautical engineering from MIT, with a thesis on orbital rendezvous mechanics that became foundational to the Gemini program's docking procedures. He is confident in a way that can sometimes read as abrasive to people who do not know him well, but it is the confidence of someone who has done the work, who knows what he knows with precision, and can defend it under pressure. He has thought deeply about what it means to go to the moon, about the weight of what they are carrying on behalf of the human species, and in the years and decades after the mission he will speak about it more openly than almost anyone, with a vulnerability and an honesty that make him in many ways the most human of the Apollo astronauts. Mike Hal Collins is the command module pilot, the man who will remain in lunar orbit while Armstrong and Aldrin descend to the surface, and he is, by his own cheerful admission, the most overlooked member of the most famous crew in history. He will circle the moon alone for 21 hours while his crewmates walk on its surface, passing behind it on each orbit into a zone of absolute radio silence, where he is more isolated from other human beings than any person has ever been. Unable to communicate with Earth, unable to communicate with Earth, unable to communicate with Armstrong and Aldrin, alone with his spacecraft and his thoughts in a silence so complete, it has no earthly equivalent. Collins handles this prospect with a characteristic lightness and equanimity that endears him to everyone who knows him. He writes later, with the dry wit that marks everything he says about the mission, that he is entirely at peace with his role, that far from feeling lonely or left out, he feels privileged and content. The man who kept the engine running while his colleagues went inside. He is funny and self-aware, and possessed of a gift for language that makes his memoir of the mission one of the finest pieces of writing to emerge from the entire space age. The launch is set for the 16th of July, 1969. In the days leading up to it, the Kennedy Space Center in Florida becomes a place of pilgrimage. An estimated 1 million people have made their way to the surrounding beaches and highways and fields, setting up camp in the Florida heat to watch with their own eyes the moment when the Saturn V rocket, the most powerful machine ever built by human hands, taller than a 35-story building, weighing 6 million pounds fully fueled, rises from its launch pad and begins the journey to the moon. They come from all over America and from all over the world, and they bring with them everything: folding chairs and pee, Icony coolers and children perched on shoulders and transistor radios crackling with the commentary from the NASA Public Affairs channel. They do not know, most of them, the precise engineering details of what they are about to witness, but they know what it means. In the largest sense, they know they are standing at the edge of something that humanity will never be able to unknow. That after this morning the world will be permanently and irrevocably divided into the time before and the time after. At 9:32 in the morning, the engines of the Saturn V ignite. The sound reaches the crowd not immediately, but after a delay of several seconds, traveling at the speed of sound across the flat Florida landscape. And when it arrives, it is not like any sound most of them have ever heard. It is less a noise than a physical force, a deep subsonic pressure that moves through the body from the ground up, that the observers feel in their chests and their teeth and their bones before they consciously register it as something heard. The rocket rises slowly at first. It seems impossibly, almost comically slow for something that is supposed to leave the Earth, and then accelerates with a majesty that silences every conversation within miles. People weep. They cheer. They stand with their mouths open and their eyes wide and their hands pressed to their hearts, because there is no other response adequate to what they are seeing. The rocket climbs into the blue Florida sky, trailing fire and thunder, growing smaller and smaller until it is a bright point of light, and then nothing. Swallowed by the immensity of the sky it has entered. Inside the spacecraft, the three astronauts are experiencing something rather different from the poetry of the observers below. Launch in a Saturn V is a physical ordeal of considerable intensity. The vibration during the first stage burn is 7. Air enough to blur the instruments. The acceleration presses each man back into his couch with a force multiple times the weight of his own body, and the noise is extraordinary even through the insulation of helmets and suits. Armstrong later describes the first stage burn as the roughest part of the ride. Not dangerous, but emphatically physical. A full-body reminder that the forces involved in leaving the Earth are not gentle ones. Then the first stage separates, and the second stage ignites, and the ride smooths out considerably. And after 12 minutes of this, 12 minutes that began on a launch pad in Florida and end in orbit around the Earth, the Saturn V has done its job, and Apollo 11 is in space. The journey to the moon takes 3 days. 3 days of traveling through the void, at speeds that ordinary language struggles to convey. At its fastest, the spacecraft is moving at roughly 25,000 miles per hour, though in the middle portions of the journey, as the Earth's gravity loses its grip, and the moon's gravity has not yet fully taken hold, it slows to a fraction of that. The crew follows a carefully planned schedule of sleep and meals and systems checks and navigation updates, conducted with the practiced efficiency of people who have trained for every minute of this journey, and know exactly what they are doing at every moment. They are not. These 3 men, given to lengthy philosophical reflection during the mission itself, they are pilots and engineers doing a job, and they do it with the focused competence that their training has built into them over years. But there are moments, looking out through the small windows at the Earth shrinking behind them, at the moon growing ahead, at the absolute star-filled darkness through which they are moving, when even the most technically focused mind cannot entirely suppress the awareness of what this is, of where they are, of the fact that they are here at all. On the 20th of July, 1969, Armstrong and Aldrin transfer into the lunar module, a spidery, ungainly-looking vehicle that has been given the call sign Eagle, and separate from Collins in the command module Columbia. The separation is clean and precise, and Collins watches from his window as Eagle moves away from him and begins its descent toward the surface, growing smaller until it disappears into the gray-white landscape below. He is alone now, more alone than any human being has ever been. He tends to his spacecraft with quiet diligence and waits. In Eagle, the descent to the lunar surface begins with the precisely calculated burn of the descent engine, and for several minutes everything proceeds exactly as planned. Then, at an altitude of about 30,000 feet, the first alarm sounds. A yellow caution light illuminates on the instrument panel, and a number, 1202, appears on the computer display. Neither Armstrong nor Aldrin has ever seen this alarm in training. Their voices remain calm as they report it to Mission Control in Houston, where a 26-year-old guidance officer named Steve Bales has approximately 3 seconds to determine whether the alarm is mission critical or whether the descent can continue. The 1202 alarm indicates that the guidance computer is overloading. It has been given more tasks than it can process simultaneously and is automatically dropping lower priority tasks to keep the essential ones running. Bales, drawing on his deep knowledge of the computer's design, makes the call. It is not a problem. Continue the descent. The alarms continue to flash. 1202 again, then 1201, and each time, Mission Control gives the same answer. Go. Continue. The computer is managing. The descent goes on, at 3,000 feet above the surface. Armstrong looks out through T-He window at the landing site and does not like what he sees. The automatic guidance system is taking them toward a crater the size of a football field, its rim littered with boulders large enough to tip the lunar module on its side or punch through its thin aluminum skin. Armstrong takes manual control, calmly, without drama, the way a pilot takes control, because this is exactly the situation his training has prepared him for. He flies Eagle forward, looking for a clear spot, the fuel gauge dropping toward the red zone, the altimeter unwinding, Houston monitoring every telemetry reading and saying nothing because there is nothing to say. 60 seconds of fuel remaining. Armstrong is still flying. 40 seconds. The surface is very close now, and there, just ahead, just to the right, a flat area, clear of large rocks. Smooth enough. He brings Eagle down over it. At 4 minutes and 6 seconds past 10 in the evening, Houston time, a blue light on the instrument panel illuminates. It is the contact light triggered by one of the probes extending from Eagle's foot pads touching the lunar surface. Armstrong and Aldrin follow their shutdown procedures with the swift precision of deep training. And then there is a stillness, a completeness, a sense of arrival so profound that for a moment neither of them speaks. Then Armstrong presses the transmit button, and his voice travels 238,000 miles through the silence of space to the waiting ears of Mission Control and the listening world. The Eagle has landed. In Houston, the flight controllers who have been rigid with tension for the past 12 minutes collapse into their chairs, some of them burying their faces in their hands, some of them simply sitting with their eyes closed and their chests heaving, absorbing the reality of what has just happened. Flight Director Gene Kranz, a man whose compo, sure during the descent has been so absolute that he has barely moved in his chair for the past hour, allows himself a single moment of private emotion before pressing the transmit button and saying, in a voice that is only slightly unsteady, "You've got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot." Armstrong and Aldrin spend several hours inside Eagle after landing, running through checklists, eating, resting, preparing for the moonwalk. Outside the windows, the lunar surface stretches away in all directions, gray and still and ancient beyond imagining, untouched for 4.5 billion years, waiting in the absolute silence of a world with no atmosphere, no weather, no sound of any kind. At 1 a.m. Houston time, Armstrong opens the hatch and begins to back down the 9 rungs of Eagle's ladder, and somewhere in the middle of that descent, he pulls a lanyard that deploys a small camera mounted on the side of the spacecraft, and the grainy black and white image it sends back to Earth, a ghostly figure in a white suit, moving slowly down a ladder in the gray moonlight, is watched by more than 600 million people, the largest television audience in the history of the world, up to that moment. He steps off the ladder and onto the surface, and the words he speaks have been turned over in his mind for months, trying to find language adequate to the moment. He does not entirely succeed. The famous line about one small step and one giant leap is slightly garbled in delivery. The article that should precede the word man dropped somewhere between his brain and his mouth, leaving a grammatical awkwardness that will be debated and analyzed for decades. But the words are right in their essential truth. It is one small step, it is one giant leap. And the 600 million people watching on their television sets, in living rooms, and public squares and bars and schools on every continent understand this completely. Buzz Aldrin follows him down the ladder, 19 minutes later, and steps onto the surface, and looks around and reaches, without apparent premeditation, for the single word that seems most adequate to what he sees. Magnificent desolation, he says. 2 words that carry within them the full weight of the experience. The beauty and the emptiness, the wonder and the aloneness, the grandeur of being in a place so completely unlike anywhere else that language itself feels insufficient. They spend 2 hours and 31 minutes on the surface. They collect 47.5 pounds of lunar rock and soil samples. They plant a flag. The flag's horizontal rod is designed to hold it extended because there is no wind on the moon to make it wave, but it is bent slightly in the planting, and this gives it a permanent suggestion of movement that somehow makes the photographs more alive. They speak by telephone with President Nixon, who calls it the most historic phone call ever made from the White House. They deploy scientific instruments that will continue to send data back to Earth for years, and through all of it, the walking, the collecting, the planting, the photographing, they are aware, in some quiet and not entirely articulable way, that they are not really doing this for themselves, or for NASA, or even for America. They are doing it for the species, for all of the human beings who have ever looked up at the moon and wondered, for everyone who is watching right now, for everyone who will come after. When Eagle lifts off from the surface and climbs back toward Collins and Columbia, it leaves behind on the moon a small silicon disk on which have been recorded messages from the leaders of 73 nations. It leaves behind the descent stage of the lunar module. On the leg of W, Hitch is mounted a plaque that reads, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." The moon keeps those things still. It will keep them for millions of years, undisturbed in its airless silence, a record of the day when the small creatures from the blue planet below found a way to come. Let that image settle softly into you now. The moon outside your window tonight, the same moon, unchanged, still holding those footprints in its ancient dust. You are part of the species that did that. You carry that in you, simply by being human, simply by being alive, in a world that was changed forever on a July night, more than 50 years ago. Breathe slowly. Let your thoughts grow quiet and soft. Let the wonder of it carry you gently, tenderly, all the way down into sleep. You are home, and the stars are watching over you. Rest now, rest deeply. You have traveled far enough for one night. Breathe in slowly, and breathe out, long and gentle and unhurried, like the first breath of a morning when there is nowhere to be and nothing to rush toward. Let your body grow heavy and warm, sinking deeper into the softness beneath you. With each exhale, each breath carrying you a little further from the busy world and a little closer to the quiet place where sleep waits patiently, with open arms. Tonight we are going somewhere extraordinary together. We are not going to rush there. We are going to drift there, the way light drifts, across a still room in the late afternoon. Slowly and without effort, touching everything softly as it moves. We are going to travel 238,000 miles from the place where you are lying right now, across the black silence of space, to the surface of another world. We are going to walk there, slowly and carefully in the footsteps of the men who went before us. And we are going to ache our time, because the moon deserves to be visited slowly. It has been waiting, after all, for 4.5 billion years. It is in no hurry, and tonight neither are we. There is a quality to the silence on the moon that has no equivalent anywhere on Earth. This is not merely a poetic observation. It is a precise and literal fact. Sound requires a medium through which to travel, requires molecules of air or water or solid matter to carry its vibrations from one place to another, and the moon has none of these things in any meaningful quantity. Its atmosphere, such as it is so thin as to be virtually non-existent. A scattering of atoms so sparse that the space between them is closer to a perfect vacuum than to anything we would recognize as air. There is no wind. There is no wind. There is no rustling of leaves or distant sound of traffic or the soft ambient murmur that fills even the quietest places on Earth with a kind of sonic texture. We are so accustomed to that we notice its presence only when it is entirely, absolutely gone. On the moon, it is gone. The silence is not the silence of a quiet room, or a still forest, or a sleeping house in the middle of the night. It is the silence of a world where sound has simply never existed. A silence so complete and so ancient that it has its own quality, its own weight, its own particular kind of presence. The astronauts who walked on the moon heard only what came through their suits. The soft hiss of the oxygen flowing through the life support system on their backs, the slight crackle of the radio communications connecting them to their crewmate in orbit and to the controllers in Houston, the sound of their own breathing, magnified slightly by the enclosed space of the helmet, steady and rhythmic and reassuring in the midst of everything else. They heard their own heartbeats. They heard the small sounds of our own bodies functioning, the only living sounds in an utterly lifeless world. And through the curved visor of the helmet, they looked out at a landscape so different from anything in human experience that several of them struggled afterward to find language adequate to describe it. Not because words failed them, but because the experience itself seemed to exist in a register that language was not originally designed to reach. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin are the first. They have landed in a region of the moon called the Sea of Tranquility, Mare Tranquillitatis in the Latin that astronomers have used for centuries to name the dark, flat plains that early observers mistook for actual bodies of water. There are no seas on the moon. There is no water of any kind on its surface. The name is a beautiful accident of misperception, and there is something quietly fitting about the fact that the place where humanity first sets foot on another world carries in its name the word for calm. Tranquility. It is the right word for this place, and for this night, and for the feeling that settles over everything, when the hatch opens and the ladder appears, and the first boot makes contact with the gray lunar soil. Armstrong descends the ladder with careful deliberation, each rung taken slowly, his white pressure suit luminous in the flat gray landscape, the Earth hanging above him in the black sky, a perfect blue and white sphere. A perfect blue and white sphere, impossibly vivid against the darkness, impossibly beautiful from this distance. He reaches the bottom rung and pauses, and then steps off, and his boot sinks perhaps an inch into the fine powdery surface, leaving an impression so sharp and so clear that it will still be visible, geologists estimate, in 10 million years. The moon has no erosion. There is no wind to smooth the edges of that print, no rain to soften it, no life of any kind to grow over it. Reclaim it. It will simply remain exactly as he left it, for longer than the human species has yet existed. A record in dust of the moment when something new arrived on this ancient world. The surface beneath his feet is unlike any ground he has ever walked on. The regolith, the scientific term for the layer of fragmented rock and dust that covers the moon's surface, has been created over billions of years by the constant bombardment of meteorites, which have pulverized the underlying rock into a fine powder, with a consistency that Armstrong later compares to powdered charcoal, or to the talcum fine dust that settles on surfaces in dry climates. It compacts slightly under his weight and springs back slightly when the weight is removed, and the footprints it holds are extraordinarily precise. Every tread mark of his boot sole, preserved in perfect detail. Every crease and contour captured with the fidelity of a plaster cast. He looks down at his own footprints and feels, in that moment, the full strangeness of what is happening. He is the first living thing to leave a mark on this surface in 4.5 billion years. The last marks left here before his were made by meteorites. Buzz Aldrin joins him on the surface, 19 minutes later, and it is Aldrin who produces, in 2 words, what may be the most accurate description of the lunar landscape ever offered. Magnificent desolation. The word magnificent captures the scale of it, the grandeur, the way the terrain stretches away in all directions, under the black sky, without any of the atmospheric haze that softens and distances earthly landscapes, so that even features miles away appear with startling clarity. Every crater rim and boulder sharp-edged and immediate. The word desolation captures everything else. The absolute absence of life, of color beyond gray and white and the occasional warm tan of the deeper soil, of movement, of the 1,000 small signs of a living world that human beings absorb so constantly and so unconsciously that they do not notice them until they are entirely gone. The gravity is 1/6 of what they experience on Earth, and this changes everything about the way movement feels. Armstrong and Aldrin both experiment in the first minutes on the surface, with different ways of getting around, walking in the normal earthly sense, one foot in front of the other. Weight shifting smoothly from heel to toe is possible but slightly awkward, because the suit is pressurized and somewhat rigid, limiting the natural flex of the ankles, and because the reduced gravity means that each step carries them further and higher than their muscles expect, creating a slight overshooting sensation that requires conscious adjustment. Many of the Apollo astronauts, on this and subsequent missions, find that the most natural and efficient way to move is a kind of loping skip, pushing off with both feet simultaneously, rising in a gentle arc, landing softly, pushing off again, a gait that looks, from the film footage, almost like slow motion bouncing, dreamlike and fluid and unlike anything seen on Earth. The Earth itself is one of the most overwhelming aspects of the experience, and nearly every astronaut who has walked on the moon mentions it in terms that suggest it is impossible to be fully prepared for, no matter how many photographs you have seen from space or how many times you have been told what to expect. It hangs in the black sky, enormous and blue and alive with the swirling white of clouds, filling perhaps 4 degrees of the visual field. About 8 times larger than the full moon appears from Earth, and it does not move. From the moon, the Earth does not rise or set the way the moon appears to do from Earth. It hangs in a fixed position in the sky, rotate, and slowly on its own axis, its face constantly changing as the cloud patterns shift and the day and night Terminator moves across its surface, but always in the same place in the lunar sky. A brilliant blue anchor point in the blackness above. Looking at it, the astronauts feel something that several of them later struggle to fully articulate. A complex mixture of longing and wonder and of fierce protective love, a sudden visceral understanding that the thin blue circle they can cover with an outstretched thumb contains every human being who has ever lived, every ocean and forest and city and mountain, every piece of music ever written and every story ever told, all of it right there. Small and fragile and unutterably precious in the surrounding immensity of darkness. Aldrin later describes a moment during his time on the surface when he stops what he's doing and simply looks at the landscape around him, at the Earth above him, at the stars that are visible even in the lunar daytime, because there is no atmosphere to scatter the sunlight and blue the sky. He takes what he privately calls a personal moment of dedication, a pause in the work to simply be present in the fullness of where he is and what is happening. He carries with him a small communion kit, a personal religious observance that he has arranged quietly with his church before the mission. And in this private moment, he performs a small ceremony of gratitude, pouring a tiny amount of wine into a chalice in the 1/6 gravity of the moon, watching it curl slowly around the inside of the cup in a way it would never move on Earth, and feeling, in that curve of wine in a chalice on the surface of the moon, something that he will spend the rest of his long life trying to put into words and never quite managing, because some experiences are simply larger than language. The work they do on the surface is wry. You'll work physical and demanding, despite the reduced gravity, or perhaps partly because of it, since the suit makes every movement an effort, and the unfamiliarity of the environment requires constant conscious attention that tires the mind, even when the body is not being pushed hard. They collect samples with rakes and scoops, designed for use in pressurized gloves, dropping rocks and soil into numbered bags that will be carefully labeled and cataloged and carried back to Earth, where geologists will spend years and decades analyzing them. They deploy a seismometer designed to detect moonquakes and the impacts of meteorites, and a laser-ranging retroreflector, a device so simple in concept and so precisely manufactured that it is still in use today, more than 50 years later, allowing scientists on Earth to bounce laser beams off its surface and measure the distance to the moon with extraordinary accuracy. They take photographs, hundreds of photographs, documenting the surface and each other and the Earth and the equipment and the footprints and the flag, a visual record of every significant feature of a visit that will never be repeated in exactly this way, by exactly these people, at exactly this moment in history. The flag planting is a moment weighted with symbolism that the astronauts approach with a mixture of pride and slight awkwardness, aware of the complexity of what it represents. The flag is American. It cannot be anything else, given that it is American astronauts who have come here in an American program that has brought them. But the mission itself has been framed from the beginning, not as an act of territorial claim, but as a journey undertaken on behalf of all humanity. The plaque on the lunar module's descent stage says, "We came in peace for all mankind," and that sentiment is genuine, not merely rhetorical. The flag is planted, not to claim the moon but to honor the country and the people whose work has made this moment possible. The pole is hollow and the horizontal bar along the top is designed to hold the flag extended in the windless environment. But the bar is slightly bent during the installation and does not extend fully, leaving a permanent soft wrinkle in the fabric that gives the flag, in all the photographs, the appearance of movement, as though a wind is blowing across the sea of tranquility that physics says cannot exist. They speak with President Nixon by telephone, a call that is broadcast live and heard by hundreds of millions of people around the world. Nixon tells them that it is the most historic telephone call ever made from the White House. Armstrong thanks him and says they are proud to represent not only the United States but men of peace of all nations. And the words are right, and the moment is real. And somewhere in the watching world, in villages in Africa, and cities in Asia, and living rooms in South America, and apartments in Europe, People are weeping with an emotion that is not entirely explicable, but is entirely human. The emotion of a species recognizing itself in an act of collective achievement so large that for a single shining moment it overwhelms all the things that divide us and reminds us of the one thing we most fundamentally share. We are all here, on this small blue world, together, and tonight, 2 of us are standing on the moon. The 2 hours and 31 minutes on the surface pass with a speed that surprises both men. Time behaves differently when every moment is saturated with novelty and significance. When every direction you turn your eyes shows you something no human being has ever seen before. There is always more to look at, always another feature of the landscape to note, always another sample that seems worth collecting or another photograph that seems worth taking. The surface extends away from them in every direction, gently rolling, marked by the overlapping circles of ancient craters of every size from vast to microscopic, the whole of it bathed in the flat, harsh light of a sun that hangs in the black sky, with no atmosphere to soften its edges or warm its color. It is the most alien landscape imaginable, and at the same time, and this is perhaps the strangest part of all, it is not entirely unfamiliar. The human brain, which has evolved to make sense of a three-dimensional physical world, finds enough here to work with. There is ground and sky. There is light and shadow. There are near things and far things. The fundamental grammar of visual experience is present even here, 238,000 miles from home, and the mind uses that grammar to organize what it sees into something it can hold and understand, even if understanding it is an act that takes years and decades and still feels, somehow, incomplete. When they climb back up the ladder and seal the hatch behind them, and Armstrong and Aldrin look at each other in the cramped interior of the lunar module with the gray dust of the moon on their suits and the smell of it in the air, a smell they will later describe, with some surprise, as similar to spent gunpowder, sharp and metallic, and faintly acrid. They do not say very much. There is not very much to say. They have been somewhere that no words were made for, and they carry that place inside them, now, in a part of themselves that is deeper than language, deeper than memory, closer to the bone than anything they have experienced before or will experience again. The sea of tranquility is quiet behind them as Eagle's ascent engine fires and carries them back toward Columbia and home. The footprints remain. The flag remains. The instruments go on gathering data in the silence. The earth hangs in its fixed place in the black sky, blue and beautiful and very, very far away. And the moon keeps all of it, as it has always kept everything, patiently and in perfect silence, and for longer than we can imagine. Let that silence come to you now. Let it settle over you like the softest blanket, like the darkness of a room where everything is exactly right and sleep comes easily and naturally and without effort. You are safe. You are home. You are on the blue planet held by its gravity, wrapped in its air, under its wide and gentle sky. Breathe slowly. Let the moon watch over you through your window tonight, as it watches over everything, as it has always watched, silver and patient and full of a quiet that has no end. Close your eyes. Let go. Drift. You are almost there. Breathe in slowly and breathe out. Let your body settle into stillness, the way a ship settles into calm water after a long journey through rough seas. Gradually, gratefully, with a deep and spreading sense of ease, let the tension in your shoulders dissolve. Let your hands rest open and soft. Let your mind release its grip on the day, on its details and its demands, and allow itself to simply float for a while in the warm dark of this quiet hour. Tonight we are going to tell a story about something that could have ended in tragedy and did not. About 3 men who traveled further from Earth than almost any human beings in history, and found themselves, at the furthest point of that journey, in a situation that by every reasonable calculation should have been unsurvivable, and about the hundreds of people on the ground who refused to accept that calculation, who sat down at their consoles and their blackboards and their work tables, and simply would not stop working until they had found a way to bring those 3 men home. This is a story about crisis and fear, and the particular kind of courage that is not dramatic or loud, but quiet and methodical and absolutely relentless. It is, in its own way, one of the most beautiful stories to come out of the entire space age, and tonight it is going to carry you gently, steadily, all the way to sleep. The mission begins on the 11th of April 1970, and it begins badly. Or rather, it begins with a series of small troubles that do not seem significant at the time, but which in retrospect carry the quality of omens that no one is positioned to read. The number 13 has already attracted a certain amount of nervous comment. The mission is Apollo 13. It is scheduled to launch at 13 minutes past the hour in Houston time. And the launch date adds up in certain numerological calculations to 13. The crew, like all astronauts, is professionally skeptical of superstition, and they dismiss these observations with the brisk pragmatism of test pilots who have spent their careers in environments where only facts and physics matter. Numbers are numbers. The mission is the mission. They climb into their spacecraft and prepare to go. The crew is led by Jim Lovell, one of the most experienced astronauts in the program, a man who has already flown 3 previous missions including Apollo 8, the first flight to orbit the moon, a journey that produced the famous Earthrise photograph and the Christmas Eve broadcast from lunar orbit that became one of the most watched television events of the decade. Lovell is 52 years old, and the accumulated experience of his spaceflight career, if not in calendar years, a man who has seen enough of what can go wrong in this business to have developed a deep and practical understanding of risk, and who is chosen with full awareness of that understanding to keep accepting it. He is the kind of person who inspires confidence not through charisma alone, but through competence. Through the visible alone, but through competence. Through the visible, tangible reality of knowing exactly what he is doing at every moment, and doing it with a steadiness that communicates itself to everyone around him. The lunar module pilot is Fred Haise, making his first space flight, a former NASA research pilot with an encyclopedic knowledge of the lunar module systems that will prove, in the days ahead, to be not merely useful but essential to survival. He is quiet and methodical, and possessed of the particular kind of calm that comes not from an absence of feeling, but from a deep professional habit of subordinating feeling to function, of acknowledging what is frightening and then setting it aside in order to do what needs to be done. The command module pilot is Jack Swigert, who has joined the crew only days before launch as a replacement for Ken Mattingly, who was exposed to German measles and grounded by the flight surgeons as a precaution. Swigert is an excellent pilot and a thorough engineer, but he is also, by his own admission, slightly less practiced with this specific crew than the mission ideally demands. In normal circumstances, this would be a minor concern. The circumstances that are coming are not normal. The launch itself is clean, and the first 2 days of the mission proceed with the comfortable routine of a crew that has trained extensively and knows its spacecraft well. The Earth shrinks behind them. The moon grows ahead. The crew settles into the familiar rhythm of a lunar transit. Meals and sleep periods and systems checks and navigation updates, the housekeeping of spaceflight that sounds mundane and is, in many ways, genuinely mundane, but which is also the foundation on which everything else rests. On the evening of the 13th of April, 56 hours into the mission, the crew is preparing for a television broadcast, a live transmission back to Earth that the networks have decided rather deflating to the astronauts, not to air, because moon missions have become so routine in the public eye that they no longer command prime time. Lovell later notes, with a dry humor that the subsequent events make somewhat painful, that they were on their way to the moon, and nobody much cared. That was about to change. At 55 hours, 54 minutes, and 53 seconds into the mission, the crew hears a loud bang, not a crack or a pop. A bang, felt as much as heard, a physical jolt that moves through the spacecraft and registers immediately in the bodies of all 3 men as something outside the range of normal experience. Warning lights illuminate, master alarm sounds, the attitude control thrusters begin firing in an attempt to comp. Sate for something. Something has changed in the spacecraft's orientation. Some force has been applied from outside. Swigert transmits to mission control the words that will become slightly misquoted in popular memory. One of the most famous sentences in the history of space exploration. Houston, he says, we've had a problem. In mission control, 109 Harrison, flight director Gene Kranz, The same Gene Kranz who guided Apollo 11 through its landing alarm crisis with such steady authority hears the transmission and feels the shift in the room that comes when experienced people recognize that something has gone genuinely wrong. The telemetry data streaming from the spacecraft tells a story that takes several minutes to interpret fully, and the story it tells is deeply alarming. Oxygen tank number 2 in the service module has exploded. The explosion has damaged oxygen tank number 1 as well, which is now venting its contents into space. The fuel cells that generate the command module's electricity run on oxygen, and as the oxygen pressure drops, the electrical power available to the command module drops with it. Within hours, perhaps less, the command module will be without power, and without power it is not a spacecraft. It is a metal shell. The realization of what this means arrives in mission control, with a force that one flight controller later describes as a physical sensation, like a blow to the chest. Apollo 13 is 200,000 miles from Earth. It cannot turn around and come directly home. The physics of orbital mechanics do not permit it. In any case, the service module propulsion system, which would be needed for such a maneuver, may have been damaged in the explosion. The only realistic path home is to continue toward the moon. Use the moon's gravity to swing around and redirect the spacecraft toward Earth, and ride that trajectory back across 250,000 miles of space. The journey will take approximately 4 days. The command module does not have the power to support 3 men for 4 days. The oxygen in the command module's tanks, between the damaged supply and the steady consumption of 3 breathing human beings, will not last 4 days. The solution, when it presents itself, is both elegant and terrifying. The lunar module, Eagle's cousin, the spidery craft, designed to carry 2 astronauts to the lunar surface and back to orbit, is still attached to the command module. Fully powered is still attached to the command module. Fully powered, with its own oxygen supply and its own life support systems and its own descent engine that can serve as the propulsion needed to correct the spacecraft's trajectory. It was designed to support 2 astronauts for 2 days on the lunar surface. It will now need to support 3 astronauts for 4 days in deep space. It was not designed for this. Its carbon dioxide removal system, its power supply, its water reserves, none of these are sized for the job that is about to be asked of them, but it is what they have. And in the hours and days that follow, the men on the ground will work with ferocious ingenuity to make it enough. Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert transfer into the lunar module Aquarius and power down the command module Odyssey to the absolute minimum, preserving the small remaining power in its batteries for the one moment when it will be desperately needed, the re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. 4 days from now, when Odyssey must be powered back up and its systems checked and its heat shield trusted to do its job. They shut hatches and turn off switches and wrap themselves in the cold, because the lunar module without the command module's power is not warm. The temperature inside Aquarius drops toward freezing as the hours pass, and the crew endures it in their suits and with blankets, improvised from whatever is available, sleeping in short cold intervals and waking stiff and uncomfortable and going back to work, because there is always more work to do. In Houston, the work never stops. Teams of engineers and flight controllers cycle through mission control and shifts, each group picking up where the last left off, maintaining a continuous thread of calculation and problem solving that runs through 4 days and 4 nights without interruption. The work is of a kind that has never been done before. There are no procedures for this situation, no checklists that cover the exact sequence of events that has unfolded, no training scenarios that match what is actually happening. Everything must be invented from scratch, worked out on blackboards and slide rules, and in the minds of people who are simultaneously exhausted and more focused than they have ever been in their lives. The problems come one after another, each one solved only to reveal the next, and through all of it, the standard that Gene Kranz sets for his team. Failure is not an option. A phrase that becomes the defining motto of the mission is not a slogan but a literal operational commitment. Every path that leads to the death of the crew is simply removed from consideration. Only paths that lead home are explored. The carbon dioxide problem is the most immediately dangerous. The lunar module's lithium hydroxide canisters, which remove carbon dioxide from the cabin atmosphere, are designed for 2 people and are filling up faster than anticipated with 3 people breathing in the confined space. The command module has additional canisters, but they are square and the lunar module's receptacles are round. The canisters are literally incompatible. A manufacturing decision made years earlier, in different programs by different teams with no reason at the time to imagine that this incompatibility would ever matter. Now it matters enormously. The engineers on the ground have approximately an hour to design a solution, using only materials that are known to be aboard the spacecraft: tape and plastic bags and cardboard from a flight plan cover and a sock, assembled according to instructions read up to the crew over the radio. The device that results is not elegant. It is held together with gray duct tape and looks like something improvised in a garage. It works perfectly. The carbon dioxide levels drop. The crew keeps breathing. The trajectory correction burns. The firing of Aquarius's descent engine to adjust the spacecraft's path around the moon and aim it precisely at the narrow entry corridor in Earth's atmosphere are performed with a precision that seems almost miraculous given the conditions under which the calculations are made. The guidance computer in the lunar module was not designed for this kind of navigation, and the crew must use manual sighting techniques and carefully timed engine burns to achieve accuracy that leaves almost no margin for error. The entry corridor is only a few degrees wide. Come in too steep and the spacecraft burns up. Come in too shallow and it skips off the atmosphere and disappears forever into deep space. The burns are executed with extraordinary care, and each one brings the trajectory closer to what it needs to be. Through all of this, the crew maintains a composure that those who know them well find simultaneously inspiring and heartbreaking. They are cold and exhausted, and they have had to absorb, in the space of a few hours, the complete destruction of the mission they trained for. The moon landing that Lovell has worked toward for years, that Hayes has spent his entire NASA career preparing for, that was within a day and a half of becoming reality, when the bang came and everything changed. They will not walk on the moon. They will not collect samples or plant a flag, or look up at the Earth from the surface of another world. They will, if everything goes right, simply survive, and they have chosen to treat survival as enough, to set aside the grief of what has been lost and focus entirely on the work of getting home. Because that is what the situation demands, and because they are, at their core, professionals of the highest order. On the 19th of April, 4 days after the explosion, the spacecraft approaches Earth. The crew transfers back into the cold, darkened command module and begins the painstaking process of powering it up on the reduced reserves of the batteries, following a checklist that has been written specifically for this situation by Ken Mattingly, the crew member who was grounded before the mission, who has spent the past 4 days in a simulator on the ground working through exactly this problem, who has not slept in longer than he can clearly remember, who owes these 3 men nothing except the fact that they are his colleagues and that this is what colleagues do. The checklist works. The systems come back online. The command module, which has been cold and dormant for 4 days, wakes up. The service module is jettisoned first, and as it tumbles away, the crew gets their first clear look at the damage. An entire panel of the service module's outer hull has been blown away, exposing the interior of the spacecraft like a wound. The sight sobers them. This is the first visual confirmation of how close the margin has been, how completely the explosion transformed their situation in a fraction of a second. Then Aquarius is jettisoned, the lunar module that has been their lifeboat for 4 days, that has kept them warm enough and breathing, and on course, must now be let go, because it has no heat shield, and cannot survive re-entry. Lovell watches it drift away and feels something he cannot entirely name. Gratitude, perhaps, or the particular sadness of parting from a thing that has served faithfully and will never be seen again. At 12 minutes past noon Houston time on the 17th of April, 1970, the Apollo 13 command module Odyssey enters Earth's atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour. The heat shield glows. The radio blackout period, When the ionized gas surrounding the capsule blocks all communication, extends to 4 minutes, longer than normal, longer than the flight controllers in Houston can entirely account for, long enough that the tension in mission control reaches a level that several people later describe as physically painful. And then, at the end of those 4 minutes, a recovery aircraft radar operator reports 3 parachutes on the horizon over the Pacific Ocean. 3 parachutes all deployed, all functioning. The capsule splashes down, and Lovell and Hayes and Swigert are recovered from the water alive and in reasonable health, and in mission control grown men and women who have not slept properly in 4 days collapse into each other's arms and weep without any self-consciousness at all, because there is absolutely nothing self-conscious about this moment. Nothing held back, nothing measured. They are home. They are home. They are home. And the world that had barely noticed Apollo 13 departing has spent 4 days watching its return, with a collective held breath that crossed every boundary of language and politics and geography. In those 4 days, the moon program that had become routine was suddenly, briefly, what it had always actually been. An act of almost incomprehensible courage, performed by human beings who were doing something they did not entirely know how to do, in an environment that wanted to kill them, sustained by the work and the love of hundreds of people on the ground who refused to let them go. Let that refusal settle into you now, warm and steady as a heartbeat. The refusal to give up, the refusal to stop working, the refusal to accept any answer that does not end with everyone coming home. There is something in that quality of commitment that is one of the finest things human beings are capable of. And tonight it is yours to carry with you into sleep. Breathe slowly. Let the story hold you. Let the darkness be soft, and the silence be kind, and the weight of your body be a comfort, rather than a burden. 3 men went very far from home and came back safely, because of the work, and the will, and the love that would not let them go. Rest now. You are home too. Sleep well. Breathe in slowly, and breathe out. Long and soft and easy, like the last breath before the body finally surrenders to sleep, and lets the conscious mind drift away into the warm dark where dreams live. Let your muscles release their last held tensions, one by one, from your shoulders down through your arms and your hands and your fingers, down through your back and your hips and your legs, all the way to the soles of your feet. Let everything go. There is nothing left to hold on to tonight. There is only the quiet and the dark, and the story waiting to unfold around you, like a blanket pulled up against the cold. Tonight we are going to visit some of the most remarkable and most overlooked chapters in the entire history of human exploration. We are going to travel to the moon not once, but 4 more times, in the company of 12 more men whose names are less famous than Armstrong and Aldrin, and yet whose courage was just as real, whose journeys were just as extraordinary, and whose contributions to human knowledge were in many ways even more profound. These are the missions that history has a tendency to footnote rather than celebrate. But they deserve better than footnotes. They do serve to be told slowly and fully, and with the reverence that is owed to any act of genuine human greatness. So tonight, that is exactly what we are going to do. After the near catastrophe of Apollo 13, the pressure on the program is enormous and comes from several directions at once. There is the pressure of public opinion, which has been shaken by the near loss of the crew and is asking, with renewed urgency, whether the risks are truly worth the rewards. There is the pressure of politics in a country that is spending billions of dollars on moon missions, while fighting an increasingly unpopular war and struggling with deep social divisions at home. And there is the pressure of science, which has been patient and persistent throughout the drama of the early missions, and is now insisting with growing force that the moon is not merely a destination to be reached and a flag to be planted, but a laboratory of staggering richness, a world that has been geologically frozen for billions of years, that has preserved in its rocks and its soil a record of the early solar system that Earth itself, with its active geology and its oceans and its atmosphere, long ago erased. The scientists want samples. They want measurements. They want astronauts who can recognize a significant rock formation when they see one and understand why it matters. They want, in short, More than footprints and flags, they want knowledge. Apollo 14 launches on the 31st of January, 1971, 9 months after the Apollo 13 emergency, and it carries with it the particular weight of a program that needs to prove itself capable of continuing. The mission commander is Alan Shepard, the first American in space, who has spent the decade since his 1961 flight grounded by an inner ear condition called Meniere's disease, and who has worked with a quiet ferocity during those years to correct the problem, to rehabilitate himself medically, and to return to flight status in time to command a moon mission. He is 47 years old when he steps onto the lunar surface, the oldest person to walk on the moon, and he carries those years and that decade of patient waiting with him in a way that gives his presence on the surface a particular emotional resonance. He has earned this more visibly than almost anyone, paid for it in ways that most of his colleagues have not had to pay. And when he finally stands on the moon, the depth of his satisfaction is something that even the reticence of his character cannot entirely conceal. Shepard and his lunar module pilot Edgar Mitchell land in the Fra Mauro Highlands, the region that Apollo 13 had been intended to visit before the explosion redirected everything. Fra Mauro is geologically significant in ways that the flat plains of the Sea of Tranquility, where Apollo 11 landed, are not. It is a region of ancient, heavily cratered terrain, believed to contain material ejected from the enormous impact that formed the Mare Imbrium Basin billions of years ago, and the samples collected there carry the potential to push back the boundaries of human understanding of the solar system's earliest history by hundreds of millions of years. Shepard and Mitchell spend more than 9 hours outside the spacecraft across 2 separate excursions, covering more ground than any previous mission and collecting 94 pounds of samples that will occupy geologists for years. Mitchell, who has a doctorate and a deeply inquiring mind, approaches the scientific work with an intensity that complements Shepard's more instinctive pilot's approach, and the 2 men work together with a complementary efficiency that produces one of the most scientifically productive surface stays of the entire program. And then, in one of the most purely human moments of the Apollo program, Alan Shepard does something that is not on the flight plan. He has secretly brought with him the head of a 6-iron golf club, which he has spent weeks figuring out how to attach to the handle of a geological sampling tool, creating a makeshift club that he can swing one-handed in the bulk of his pressure suit. He drops 2 golf balls onto the lunar surface and swings, and misses the first and hits the second, and it travels in the 1/6 gravity, with no air resistance to slow it. What Shepard describes with characteristic showmanship as miles and miles, it does not actually travel miles. But the image of an astronaut hitting a golf ball on the moon. Against the backdrop of the gray highlands and the black sky and the distant blue curve of the earth, captures something essential about the American spirit and the irreducible human tendency to find playfulness even in the midst of the most serious undertaking imaginable. Scientists grumble slightly. Everyone else smiles, and the smile is, in its own way, as valuable as the samples. Apollo 15 is where the program transforms most visibly from an exercise in exploration to an exercise in science. The mission launches in July of 1971 and carries with it a piece of hardware that changes everything about what is possible on the lunar surface: the Lunar Roving Vehicle, a battery-powered 4-wheeled car designed specifically for the moon, capable of carrying 2 astronauts and their equipment across the lunar terrain at speeds of up to 8 miles per hour. The rover weighs 77 pounds in the moon's 1/6 gravity, folds up to fit inside a small compartment in the lunar module's descent stage, and deploys on the surface with the mechanical precision of a device that has been tested and refined through thousands of hours of engineering work. It is, in its own quiet way, one of the most elegant pieces of hardware the space program ever produced. The crew of Apollo 15 consists of Dave Scott as commander, Jim Irwin as lunar module pilot, and Al Worden as command module pilot, and Scott in particular brings to the mission a scientific preparation and seriousness of purpose that sets a new standard for what an Apollo commander can be. Scott has worked closely with the geological team preparing for the mission, has spent months in the field in places like Hawaii and Iceland and the mountains of New Mexico learning to read the story that rocks tell, learning to see a landscape the way a geologist sees it rather than the way a pilot sees it. And the difference this preparation makes on the surface is immediately and continuously apparent in the quality of his observations and the significance of the samples he selects. Scott and Irwin land in the Hadley Apennine region at the foot of the lunar Apennine mountain range, peaks that rise 15,000 feet above the surrounding plain, created by the same ancient impact that formed the Imbrium Basin, their slopes composed of some of the oldest material on the moon. The landscape is the most dramatic of any Apollo landing site, and the crew's descriptions of it carry a quality of genuine awe that the flatness of the earlier landing zones had not quite produced in the same way. The mountains fill a substantial portion of the sky when you stand at the base of them, Scott reports, and the scale of the thing, the realization that these are real mountains, that they were formed by real geological processes that have been frozen in time for billions of years, that you are standing at their base on the surface of another world, takes time to absorb even for a man who has trained himself to approach this environment scientifically. On the slopes near Hadley Rill, a sinuous canyon carved into the lunar surface by ancient lava flows, its walls exposing cross-sections of lunar geology, like the pages of a book. Scott picks up a small rock that catches his eye. It is pale and crystalline, quite different from the dark basaltic material that surrounds it, and Scott recognizes it immediately as something significant. It is later identified as a piece of anorthosite, a type of rock that forms when magma cools very slowly, and its age when analyzed in the laboratory turns out to be approximately 4.5 billion years, making it one of the oldest objects ever held in human hands. A fragment of the original lunar crust formed in the first 100 million years of the solar system's existence. It becomes known as the Genesis Rock, and its discovery validates in the most direct possible way the entire scientific rationale for sending geologically trained astronauts to the moon rather than simply collecting random samples. You have to know what you are looking for to find it. Apollo 16 follows in April of 1972, landing in the Descartes Highlands, a region chosen specifically because its terrain was believed, based on orbital photographs, to be composed of ancient volcanic rock that would provide a window into a different chapter of the moon's geological history than the lava plains visited by earlier missions. Commander John Young and lunar module pilot Charlie Duke spend more than 20 hours on the surface across 3 separate excursions, covering nearly 17 miles in the rover, and collecting 211 pounds of samples, the largest sample collection of any Apollo mission to that point. Ken Mattingly, who was grounded from Apollo 13 by the measles exposure and who spent those 4 days writing the procedures that helped bring that crew home, finally gets his moon mission as the command module pilot of Apollo 16, flying the orbiting spacecraft with the quiet competence that is the appropriate end to a story that began with a very unkind stroke of luck. The Descartes Highlands turn out not to be volcanic in the way that the pre-mission analysis predicted. The rocks that Young and Duke collect are impact breccias rather than volcanic materials. A finding that overturns some of the existing models of lunar geological history and requires a significant revision of the scientific community's understanding of how the highlands were formed. This is, from a scientific perspective, exactly what you hope will happen when you send human observers to a new environment. Not confirmation of what you already believe, but surprise, revision, the productive disruption of existing understanding by contact with reality. The moon, it turns out, is more complex and more interesting than the models predicted, and every mission that lands on it reveals another layer of that complexity. But it is Apollo 17, the last of the lunar missions, that carries the most weight, the weight of finality, of closure, of the knowledge that this is the last time, for reasons of politics and budget and shifting national priorities, that human beings will make this journey for the foreseeable future. The mission launches on the 7th of December, 1972, the only nighttime launch of the Apollo program, and the sight of the Saturn V rising from its launch pad in the darkness. The whole Florida coastline illuminated by the exhaust plume. Visible from hundreds of miles away, the night turned briefly into a kind of artificial day, is described by everyone who witnesses it as the most beautiful launch of the entire program, as though the program itself is putting on its finest display for its own farewell. The crew includes Harrison Schmitt, a professional geologist with a doctorate from Harvard who has spent years working with NASA on the scientific preparation for the Apollo missions, and who is, uniquely among all the Apollo astronauts, a scientist first and a pilot second, rather than the other way around. Schmidt's presence on the surface of Apollo 17 is the fulfillment of a long campaign by the scientific community to get one of their own onto the moon before the program ends, and the quality of his observations on the surface justifies every argument that was ever made on his behalf. He sees the moon the way a geologist sees it, which is to say he sees its history and its present appearance, reads its past and its rocks and its formations, understands instinctively what questions to ask and where to look for the answers. The landing site is the Taurus Littrow Valley, a narrow canyon flanked by mountains of dark volcanic material, chosen because it offers the possibility of sampling both ancient highland material and more recent volcanic deposits in close proximity. Schmitt and Commander Gene Cernan spend more than 22 hours on the surface across 3 excursions, covering nearly 22 miles in the rover and collecting 243 pounds of samples, the most of any Apollo mission. And it is Schmitt who, on the second excursion, notices something in the soil that stops him mid-stride and produces, in his voice, a quality of pure scientific excitement that is quite different from the more measured tones of his pilot crewmates. The soil around a small crater is orange, not gray, the color of everything else on the moon. Orange, a vivid, almost rusty orange that stands out against the gray regolith like a stain. Cernan comes over to look and his voice carries the same excitement. They collect samples eagerly, and when those samples are analyzed back on Earth, they are found to be tiny glass beads, created by ancient volcanic fire 3.5 billion years ago. Their color the preserved, signature of a geological event that happened when the Earth was barely 1 billion years old. It is one of the most striking individual discoveries of the entire program, found by a man who knew how to look. On the 14th of December 1972, Gene Cernan climbs the ladder of the lunar module for the last time, and becomes, as he does so, the last human being to stand on the surface of the moon. He pauses before climbing, and says words that he has clearly thought carefully about. Words that acknowledge the finality of the moment without surrendering to it, that honor what has been done and hold open the possibility of what might yet be done. He says that he believes humanity's challenge of tomorrow will include going back to the moon and beyond, and that whatever that challenge is, he is confident that America's role in it will be to lead humankind. Then he climbs the ladder, and the hatch closes, and the ascent engine fires, and the last human footprints on the moon are left behind in the Taurus Littrow Valley, sharp-edged and perfectly preserved in the airless silence, waiting. The 12 men who walked on the moon between 1969 and 1972 brought back 842 pounds of lunar samples that are still being studied today, that have been shared with scientists in countries around the world, that have contributed to a body of knowledge about the formation and early history of the solar system that reaches far beyond anything that could have been predicted when the program began. They deployed scientific instruments that transmitted data for years after the missions ended. They produced thousands of photographs that changed the way the human species sees itself in relation to the universe it inhabits. They demonstrated, in the most direct and undeniable way possible, that human beings can go to places that seem impossibly far away and come back alive. That, at the combination of engineering and courage and scientific curiosity, is capable of things that defy reasonable expectation. The later missions, Apollo 14, 15, 16, 17, do not have the mythic simplicity of Apollo 11, the first footprint, the first words, the first moment. They do not have the dramatic urgency of Apollo 13, the crisis and the rescue, and the survival against impossible odds. What they have is something quieter and in many ways more sustaining. The steady, patient accumulation of knowledge, mission by mission, sample by sample, observation by observation. They have the image of Alan Shepard hitting a golf ball on 1/6 gravity. They have the Genesis rock 4.5 billion years old, held in a gloved hand 238,000 miles from Earth. They have the orange soil of Taurus Littrow, a color that should not exist there, and does. A reminder that the universe is always more interesting than our models of it. They have Gene Cernan's last footprint, still there tonight in the lunar dust, waiting with the patience of a world that has been waiting since before the first life appeared on Earth. Let that patience come to you now, soft and deep as the darkness of a clear winter night. The patience of the moon, holding those footprints in its ancient gray dust, keeping them for us across the years and the decades, and whatever centuries come next. There is something comforting in that keeping, in the idea that some things endure, unchanged while everything else shifts and changes and moves on. The moon keeps what it is given. It always has. Breathe slowly. Feel the weight of your body, heavy and warm and perfectly at rest. Feel the darkness around you, soft and kind. The darkness of a room where nothing is wrong and nothing needs attention, and sleep comes easily and naturally and without effort. 12 men walked on the moon in Cam, home carrying pieces of another world. Tonight, those pieces are in laboratories and museums and university collections around the planet, still giving up their secrets to the scientists who study them, still teaching us things we did not know about the place we came from and the solar system we live in. And the moon is outside your window tonight. The same moon, unchanged, patient, keeping the footprints in its dust and the memories in its ancient gray silence. Let it watch over you as you sleep. Let the story carry you the rest of the way down. You are almost there. Rest now. Rest deeply and completely. The moon is keeping watch. Breathe in slowly and breathe out. Long and warm and completely unhurried, like the last breath of a day that has been full and rich and worth every moment of living. Let your body release its final held tensions, all the small accumulated tightnesses of hours and effort and attention, letting them dissolve now into the softness beneath you, into the darkness around you, into the quiet that has been waiting all day for exactly this moment. You have arrived. There is nowhere else to go tonight. There is nothing left to do or decide or remember. There is only this, the stillness, and the dark, and one last chapter of a story that began many nights ago, with a world divided by fear and ambition, and the ancient human hunger to reach beyond what has ever been reached before. Tonight we bring that story home, not with a rocket or a splashdown or a crew of exhausted and triumphant astronauts climbing out of a capsule into the warm Pacific sunlight, but with something quieter than that, and in its own way more enduring. Tonight we ask the question that gives the whole story its deepest meaning. Not what did they do, but what did it leave behind? Not where did they go, but what did the going change? Not how did they get there, but what are we still carrying all these decades later? From the fact that they did, the legacy of Apollo is not a single thing. It is not a technology or a discovery or a photograph or a phrase, though it contains all of these. It is something more like a permanent alteration in the conditions of human life. A change in what is known to be possible. A change in how the species understands its own place in the universe. A change in the relationship between human imagination and human capability that cannot be undone and has not yet finished producing its effects. When Neil Armstrong stepped off the bottom rung of the Eagle's ladder and onto the surface of the moon on a July night in 1969, something shifted in the deep structure of human self-understanding that is still shifting now, still working its way through everything we think and build and dream and attempt. The Apollo program ended in 1972. Its legacy is nowhere near finished. Begin with the most immediate and most tangible layer. The technology. The Apollo program required the invention, from scratch, of capabilities that did not exist when Kennedy made his promise in 1961. And the process of inventing them produced advances that spread far beyond the space program into the fabric of ordinary life, in ways that most people have never traced back to their origin. The integrated circuit, the microchip, the foundational technology of the entire digital age, the thing that makes possible every smartphone and laptop and tablet and medical device and automobile that exists in the modern world, was not invented by NASA, but its development was dramatically accelerated by the Apollo program's demand for computing power that was small enough and light enough to fly to the moon. The guidance computers on the Apollo spacecraft were among the first devices to use integrated circuits at scale, and the manufacturing expertise in the demand that NASA provided in those years helped drive the cost of microchips down from hundreds of dollars per unit to pennies, making them available for the consumer electronics revolution that would follow. The same pattern repeats across dozens of technologies. The need to monitor the health of astronauts in real time from the ground produced advances in biomedical telemetry that became the foundation of modern remote patient monitoring systems. The challenge of creating food that was safe, lightweight, and nutritious enough to sustain astronauts during missions lasting up to 2 weeks produced innovations in food preservation and processing that found their way into supermarkets and emergency relief programs and the kitchens of ordinary households. The development of lightweight high-performance materials for spacecraft construction, foams and fabrics and alloys that needed to be simultaneously strong and light and resistant to extremes of temperature, produced materials that now appear in athletic shoes and firefighter suits, and the insulation in the walls of buildings. The water filtration systems developed for spacecraft, designed to produce clean drinking water from recycled waste in a completely closed environment, became the basis for portable water purification technologies that have saved lives in disaster zones and developing countries around the world. The list goes on, and it is genuinely long. And none of this is the point of the Apollo program in the sense that none of it was what Kennedy was talking about when he stood before Congress in 1961 and made his promise. The spin-off technologies are a byproduct, a consequence, a bonus, the inevitable harvest of a decade of intensive investment in the hardest engineering problems the human species had ever attempted to solve. You cannot spend 10 years pushing the boundaries of what is technically possible across every field of engineering simultaneously, without producing knowledge and capability that overflows the original container and spills into everything else. Apollo was that kind of effort. Its overflow changed the world. But the technological legacy, as significant as it is not the deepest layer. Beneath it lies something harder to measure, and more important, the scientific legacy, the body of knowledge about the moon and through the moon, about the early history of the Earth and the solar system that the Apollo missions made possible and that scientists are still mining today. The 842 pounds of lunar samples, returned by the 6 successful landing missions, have been studied by researchers in dozens of countries across more than 5 decades, and they continue to yield new information as analytical techniques improve and new questions are asked of old material. The samples have helped establish the age of the moon at approximately 4.5 billion years, consistent with the age of the solar system itself. They have provided crucial evidence for the giant impact hypothesis, the theory that the moon was formed when a Mars-sized body collided with the early Earth, ejecting a cloud of material that eventually coalesced into the moon we see today. They have revealed the history of bombardment that the inner solar system experienced in its early years, a period of intense meteorite impacts that affected Earth as well as the moon, and that may have played a role in the origin of life by delivering complex organic molecules from space. The scientific instruments deployed on the lunar surface by Apollo crews continued operating long after the astronauts returned home, transmitting data across the years and in some cases the decades. The seismometers detected thousands of moonquakes, revealing the internal structure of the moon in ways that orbital observation could never achieve. The laser-ranging retroreflectors, those simple arrays of glass prisms left on the surface by Apollo 11, 14, and 15, are still in use today. bounced by lasers from observatories around the world. Their returning pulses measuring the distance to the moon with millimeter precision, and revealing, among other things, that the moon is slowly moving away from the Earth at a rate of about 1.5 inches per year. This is knowledge that changes our understanding of the Earth-Moon system, of the history of the tides, of the conditions under which life evolved on this planet. It comes from a device left on another world by a human hand more than 50 years ago, still quietly doing its job in the airless silence of the lunar surface. The photographs. The legacy of Apollo includes the photographs, and the photographs deserve their own consideration because they did something that no amount of technical data or scientific analysis could do. They changed the way the human species sees itself. The image known as Earthrise, taken by astronaut Bill Anders during the Apollo 8 mission in December of 1968, shows the Earth rising above the lunar horizon, a small, intensely blue and white sphere hanging in the absolute blackness of space, vivid and fragile and alone, the only color in a universe of gray and black. It was not the first photograph of the Earth from space, but it was the first to carry the full emotional weight of the perspective, the first to make people feel, in their bodies and their hearts rather than simply in their minds, what it means to live on a planet. The nature photographer Galen Rowell called it the most influential environmental photograph ever taken, and the timing of its publication, in December of 1968, just as the environmental movement was gathering momentum, just as the first Earth Day was being planned, suggests that the image and the movement fed each other in ways that are difficult to fully untangle. People who saw the Earth from the moon could never entirely unsee it. The idea of the planet as a single, shared, finite home, fragile enough to hold in the eye, small enough to cover with a thumb, entered the culture through that image and never left. The other great photograph is the one taken by Apollo 17 astronaut Harrison Schmitt, or possibly by Ron Evans, or possibly by Jack Cernan. No one has ever been entirely certain which of the three men pressed the shutter on the 7th of December 1972 during the outward journey to the moon. It shows the fully illuminated Earth against the blackness of space, every ocean and continent visible, the swirling white of the cloud systems tracing the patterns of weather across the globe. It has become known as the blue marble, and it is quite possibly the most reproduced photograph in human history. It is the image that has appeared on more magazine covers, and more book jackets, and more posters, and more desktop wallpapers than any other single image ever made. It is the image that, perhaps more than any other, defines how the 21st century thinks about the Earth, as a thing of extraordinary beauty, suspended in darkness, complete in itself, worth protecting. These photographs are part of the legacy of Apollo, in a way that goes beyond aesthetics, beyond even environmental consciousness. They represent a permanent change in the available perspective, a point of view that humanity now carries and cannot put down. Before Apollo, the Earth was the context within which everything happened, the ground beneath all experience, too large and too encompassing to be seen as a thing in itself. After Apollo, the Earth is an object, beautiful and specific, and finite and alone. And this change in how it can be perceived is a change in what it is possible to think and feel about it. Every generation born since 1968 has grown up with the Earthrise photograph available to them, has grown up knowing in a way that no previous generation could know that the world they live in looks like that from the outside. That knowledge is part of the inheritance of the Apollo program, passed down not in textbooks but in the visual culture of the species itself. And then there is the deepest legacy of all, the one that is hardest to put into words, and most important to try. The legacy of what Apollo proved about what human beings are capable of, the legacy of what it demonstrated about the relationship between imagination and reality, between the thing that is dreamed and the thing that is built, between the promise made in a moment of audacious hope, and the moment 8 years later when that promise is kept in the dust of another world. Kennedy said it in 1961, and it happened in 1969, and the gap between those two events contains 10,000 individual stories of people who showed up every day and did work they had never done before toward a goal that had never been achieved, and who succeeded. That fact, the bare irreducible fact that it happened, that it was real, that it was done, is perhaps the most powerful thing the Apollo program left behind, because every generation that comes after has to decide what it believes is possible, has to decide how big to dream, how far to reach, how much to invest in the idea that something genuinely new and genuinely important might be achieved in their lifetimes. And for every generation since Apollo, the answer to the question of what is possible has to reckon with the fact that human beings went to the moon, not in a story, not in a simulation, not in a dream. In reality, with real people and real spacecraft, making real mistakes and solving them with real ingenuity and landing on the surface and walking around and coming home. If that was possible, if that of all things was achievable, then the ceiling on what can be attempted is much higher than it might otherwise appear. This is the legacy that lives in the engineers and the scientists and the explorers of every generation since, the ones who built the Space Shuttle and the International Space Station and the Hubble Space Telescope and the Mars rovers and the James Webb Space Telescope. That instrument of almost unimaginable sensitivity that now peers back to the first light of the universe, to galaxies forming in the first few 100 million years after the Big Bang, showing us things that no previous generation of human beings has ever seen. All of it traces a line back to Apollo. Not directly, not simply, but truly, through the culture of ambitious engineering, through the institutions and the expertise and the sense of what is possible that the program created and left behind. And the legacy lives in the children. It lives in every child who has ever looked up at the moon on a clear night and known, not as a story but as a fact, a real and verified and undeniable fact, that people have been there, that human footprints are in that dust right now. Tonight, as you look at it, that the distance between here and there, which looks so vast and feels so impossible, was crossed by people who were made of the same stuff as you, who were afraid and uncertain and imperfect, and who went anyway. The knowledge that this is true, that it actually happened, is a kind of permanent permission to reach further than seems reasonable, to attempt more than seems achievable. To attempt more than seems achievable, to trust the combination of human ingenuity and human courage to find a way through problems that do not yet have solutions. There are people alive today who are planning to go back to the moon. There are programs underway and rockets being built and spacesuits being designed and landing sites being selected and astronauts being selected and astronauts being selected and astronauts being trained for missions that will return humans to the lunar surface for the first time in more than 50 years. There are plans, serious, funded, technically credible plans, for human missions to Mars within the lifetimes of children who are alive right now. Children who will grow up carrying in their cultural inheritance the photographs of Earthrise and the blue marble in Armstrong's footprint and the orange soil of Taurus Littrow. When those children go to Mars, and some of them they will carry Apollo with them. They will carry it the way all explorers carry the journeys of those who went before them, as both inspiration and foundation, as the proof that the thing is possible and the knowledge base from which the next step is taken. The moon is outside your window tonight, the same moon that Armstrong and Aldrin stood on, that Cernan was the last to leave, that 12 men visited in 4 years, and that has been waiting ever since for the next visitors to arrive. It is 238,000 miles away, and it looks, from here, like a lamp hung in the dark, familiar, constant, patient. It does not know what it means to us. It is a rock, after all. A large gray rock with no atmosphere and no life and no awareness of the footprints pressed into its dust, or the instrument still ticking on its surface, or the laser pulses bouncing off its retroreflectors every night in the service of human knowledge. It does not know what it gave us when we went to it. But we know, we carry it, in our technologies and our science and our photographs, and our sense of what is possible and our willingness to dream large enough to frighten ourselves a little. We carry it in the stories we tell our children about the time. What, in human beings, decided to do the hardest thing they had ever attempted, and did not stop until it was done. We carry it in the particular quality of hope that only comes from knowing, not just believing, but knowing, that the impossible has been accomplished before and can be accomplished again. The legacy of Apollo is still being written. It will still be being written when the next footprints appear on the moon, and when the first footprints appear on Mars, and when the species that began its spacefaring journey with a 15-minute arc above the Atlantic Ocean looks back from some future vantage point that none of us can yet imagine, and traces the long, brave, stumbling, magnificent line of the journey that brought them there. That line runs through Tranquility Base. It runs through the cold interior of Aquarius, 4 days from Earth, held together by duct tape and human will. It runs through the orange soil of Taurus Littrow, and the Genesis rock and the blue marble and the quiet voice of Neil Armstrong, saying the Eagle has landed. It runs through every engineer who stayed late, and every flight controller who refused to give up, and every astronaut who climbed into a spacecraft, knowing the risks and trusting the work. It runs ultimately through the simple and extraordinary fact of what human beings did when they looked up at the moon and decided, with everything they had, to go. Let that line run all the way to you here tonight. You are part of that story. You live in the world that Apollo made, a world that knows what it looks like from the outside, a world that has left its footprints on another world, a world that has proven to itself that the distance between a dream and its fulfillment is nothing more than work and time and the refusal to stop. Breathe slowly. Let the story settle into you like warmth, like light, like the feeling of arriving somewhere, you have been traveling toward for a long time. Let your body grow heavy and your mind grow soft, and the darkness around you become the comfortable, familiar darkness of a room where everything is exactly as it should be. The moon is watching. The stars are out. The footprints are still there in the dust, sharp and clear and permanent, waiting for whoever comes next. And you tonight are home. Rest now. Rest deeply and completely and without reservation. You have traveled far enough. Sleep well. The journey continues in the morning. And so ends our calm journey through one of the greatest stories ever lived. From the rivalry that ignited the space race, to Kennedy's bold promise, to the quiet heroism of Mercury and Gemini, to the heartbreak of Apollo 1, to the breathtaking footsteps on the moon, to the courage of Apollo 13, to the forgotten brilliance of the later missions, and finally to the legacy that still shapes the world you live in today. It has all been told now, slowly and gently, just for you. These were real people, real courage, real dreams turned into reality by nothing more than will and work, and the refusal to believe that something was impossible simply because it had never been done before. And now the story is complete. The Saturn V has returned to its launch pad. The astronauts are home. The moon hangs quietly outside your window, as it always has, as it always will. Patient, silver, eternal. It is time for you to rest. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts grow quiet. Let the weight of your body sink deeper into the warmth beneath you. There is nothing left to think about tonight. Nothing left to hold on to. The day is done. The story is told. The only thing left now is sleep. Deep, peaceful, healing sleep. Close your eyes. You are safe. You are still. You are home. Good night. This completes the full history for sleep. One Small Step series. Would you like me to now compile all 9 points plus the hook, subscribe reminder, and conclusion into one complete master script document?